People like to brag and say they'd never done Oblivion's main quest. I find this strange, as people put an unusual emphasis on the main quests of these games in terms of how they end the game. However, neither Morrowind nor Oblivion nor Skyrim's main quest actually marks the end of their respective Elder Scrolls game. The end of the game is really just the last time you hit exit game on a character. However, what people can't say is that they haven't started Oblivion's main quest, unless you're somehow in the minority of individuals whose first playthrough involved an alternative start mod. So we have to go back to the beginning. The introduction. We are a prisoner sitting in a cell inside the Imperial City prison. Emperor Uriel Septim VII, with a group of Blade bodyguards, uses a secret exit inside our cell to escape. We follow, as the Emperor has had visions of us before and trusts us. He gives us the Amulet of Kings, and we witness his assassination. We're instructed to go to Wayne Priory, and we leave. As we exit the sewers, we're told to either fast travel to Coral, or to follow the quest marker to get there. Now before we set off, there's something that I feel merits discussion at this juncture. Why was the Emperor skipping town? The obvious answer is to escape the Mythic Dawn assassins, but why? Secret passages out of cities typically exist in the event a city is besieged and the defenders aren't confident they can keep the attackers out. It's a way to get your leadership out of the inevitable torture and execution. This is not what you do in the event of an assassination attempt, because now instead of being surrounded by guards, you're surrounded by ambush positions. But fine. I guess we'll assume that the Blades have decided that there may be infiltrators in the Imperial Palace and they can't defend them there anymore. What are their options? Firstly, teleportation magic.
For 65 years, I've ruled as Tamriel's emperor.
But did you install a teleporter in the Imperial Palace? That apparently doesn't merit special permission, and besides, you're the Emperor. Even if there is no teleporter out of the palace, the Emperor is a master of the mystic arts, so Uriel definitely knows how to cast Recall or Divine Intervention. But that would be illegal. We may be fleeing for our lives here, but we aren't criminals, goddammit. Okay, so you're in the Imperial Palace and you want to not be. Go through the sewers. Except the only palace sewers entrance connecting to the palace proper is lost knowledge that is only later recovered during the Thieves Guild. So I guess they went across the surface, through the market district, crossed the bridge to the prison district, went into the bastion, and then came down to our cell block. So they were going to leave through the same sewer exit we use, right? Which is not far from a shallow point in the lake. There are 4 ways to get off this island without swimming. The Imperial Dragon Bridge, the wood bridge in the northwestern corner, a shallow part in the lake in the northeast, and a shallow part in the south. What's our plan after that? Maybe we take the Emperor to a fort. Except there aren't any Imperial Legion forts in Cyrodiil. The closest fort is Fort Urasek, which is full of goblins. The second closest fort is Shalman, which is full of undead. Fine, we're going up to Cloud Ruler Temple. Except one little thing.
I was born 87 years ago.
So you're telling me you're going to march an 87-year-old man up this mountain to Cloud Ruler Temple. Are we confident that he's even going to be able to breathe up there? And the answer is yeah, because have you seen the Imperial Palace? Cardio day is every day when you live in a skyscraper with no elevator. I mean, we see the guy on the roof in the trailer. Uriel's probably ripped under that robe. But we don't even have to get up that far. The road is Ambush Alley. Again, trying to get Uriel out of the city is probably not that great a plan. Caius Casades in Morrowind was talking about a secession crisis 6 years ago, so surely you guys have prepared something in the interim besides, take him to the fort high in the mountains. Okay, so what are our options? You could have just stayed in the Bastion. The prison district is like a fortress, and the only downside are the prisoners, of which there are only 4. But if you don't want to go that route, you could instead go to the Arcane University. Sure, there might be hidden necromancers, and it would suck to flee from one death cult to another, but it's highly defensible. There are battle mages there, and a bunch of powerful wizards. You could also go to the waterfront and commandeer a ship and then sail away from the city. Oh wait, there's a shallow section there, so you'd have to get out and push the boat. The only problem with the main gate is that there aren't any horses at the stable. Also, here's a question. So why didn't they march him around the prison? You'd get to the sewer exit faster and could even commission some legionaries to escort you. Or if we're really dedicated to wading through feces because you think it'll get the Dawn to stop following you, you could enter the market sewers at a couple different shops in their basement and then connect to the North Tunnel, which exits equidistant from 2 different land bridges. It's not implausible, as Boris seems to know the sewers pretty well. Or take the Southeast Tunnel, which you enter in the Arboretum. It's the farthest from a land bridge, but the simplest and shortest of the sewers. But fine, the invisible hand of fate pushes them to go through the prison district sewers, because they felt they had to start in prison, and they showed the scene in the E3 demo. On our arrival at Wayne Priory, we're directed to speak with Joffrey, a priest who is secretly the Grand Master of the Blades.
Emperor Uriel? Do you know something about his death?
Yeah, I know that instead of bringing the amulet to you directly, I instead entered into a gladiatorial arena, started from nothing and became its grand champion, and then left that arena to sign up with a mercenary company, discovered a conspiracy by a rival company, and subsequently wiped them all out, became the leader of the Fighters Guild in the process, and now I'm currently in the 15-hour section between the end of the Fighters Guild and beginning of the Mages Guild, and I need to access some Oblivion gates for sigil stones, so I may have finally decided to bring you the Amulet of Kings. I know it might be a bit late, but here you go.
As unlikely as your story sounds, I believe you.
Now, it's impossible to not make a comparison to Morrowind given the extreme and obvious similarity that exists between Joffrey and the character Caius Casades. Both Morrowind and Oblivion start with the player character being released from prison by the Imperial Authority with the instructions to deliver something to the regional leader of the Blades. Both characters are old, balding Imperials who have taken cover identities as unlikely suspects of espionage. Casades was a skooma addict, and Joffrey was a monk. Both characters fill the role of giving the player directions that constitute the main quest. Now for the differences. The player has little inkling of what their true use to the Blades is in Morrowind. Your only clues will be to read the documents that you're assigned to collect for Casades, and if you don't, Caius will eventually explain your role in the Nerevarine prophecy. Whereas, from the outset of Oblivion, the character is intimately aware of what their role in this story is.
Behold, in darkness, a doom sweeps the land. You. I've seen you. You are the one from my dreams. Then the stars were right, and this is the day. What path can be avoided whose end is fixed by the almighty gods? These are the closing days of the Third Era, and the final hours of my life.
Stranger.
If the story was realistic, and bear with me on that sentiment, then Joffrey would thank us for the amulet and send us on our way. However, I appreciate that sometimes unrealistic things have to happen in stories for the sake of, well, storytelling. Joffrey, however, begins divulging information to the player that he really shouldn't, at least not yet. What if, for instance, the player was actually the Mythic Dawn member who killed the Emperor after hearing his instructions, then managed to kill the player and Boris and taken the Amulet of Kings, and this was a ploy to try and uncover any illegitimate heirs? Is Joffrey so confident in his cover identity that he's willing to divulge information to a complete stranger simply off the idea that Uriel Septim was a quirky guy who knows a protagonist when he sees one? Now, Casades trusts the player because he has verifiable proof that he's been sent by the Empire. Even if he didn't, Morrowind has another trick up his sleeve. After introducing ourselves to Casades, he dismisses us with only one order: to get a job. In that interim, it's not unreasonable that he reached out to Celis Gravius, the man who gave us our orders at Seyda Neen, to verify this information. Joffrey has no equivalent moment, because he really can't. Fixing this inherent problem of trapping the player in the main quest would take one big change to the game: delaying the destruction of Kvatch.
Bad idea. Suddenly destroying an entire city housing quest content and maybe the player's house would probably foster more resentment towards the game than the Daedra. In that situation, I'd imagine that most players would reload a save if they found out the city was destroyed, and then proceed to complete everything they could in Kvatch until they were okay with it being leveled, which sort of defeats the purpose of destroying the city in the first place.
How true is this sentiment, however? Breville, for instance, is a city that doesn't get destroyed, which only has 8 quests, 12 if you count the Thieves Guild quests that start in Breville but don't actually take place here. Imagine for a moment that it's possible during a quest for Breville to get destroyed. What exactly changes in Oblivion? A Mages Guild quest, 2 Dark Brotherhood quests, 3 side quests, a main quest, and a quest to buy the house. Maybe it's frustrating if your Breville hovel gets blown up, but one short quest to rebuild it in the ruins and bam, all your stuff's back. Just void the Mages Guild quest, the Dark Brotherhood seems like they would hang out in the ruins, and losing 3 side quests sucks, but it helps create the illusion that the cities are in danger if one gets destroyed. You could sidestep the issue entirely by making it so Kvatch just doesn't have a home for sale. That might be a death flag, but the benefits of having the city outweigh the alternative reality criticisms it would endure for being designed for destruction. Obviously, there are time concerns for Bethesda, but don't discount the idea entirely because it might be an inconvenience for the player. Nobody in the Fighters Guild acknowledges their friends that perished in the city. Archmage Traven will conveniently decide to not assign a school of magic to the Kvatch Guild Hall prior to its destruction. Well, sad to say, but such wasn't the only forgotten city of Cyrodiil, given the only thing people outside of Kvatch have to say is praise for the player when they save it.
Did it, Patrick! We saved the city!
If Kvatch actually exists prior to the main quest, it could be a simple city. A few quests, most of them simple and might only pay out gold. Kvatch's lack of quests could even be attributed to it being a quiet, peaceful area. It would have a simple recommendation quest for the Mages Guild, which would get waived if the player joins after the guild hall is destroyed. And like most Fighters Guild halls, it would serve no purpose. It's not like there isn't a precedent in Oblivion for areas and characters that get destroyed and killed. Look at the Bruma Mages Guild Hall. The minority of people who care about getting 100% just grab the Dremora Lord summon spell and invest in the Alchemist ahead of time. Everyone else gets caught by surprise and generally praises that quest.
The only time the Mages Guild reaches out of storytelling mediocrity is the quest where the Necromancer King attacks the Bruma Mages Guild, destroying it and killing many of its residents. Had the characters in Bruma been more fleshed out, then this could have worked as a gut punch which would have given the player a reason to hate the Necromancers.
As it stands, we get none of the benefits of having Kvatch exist prior to its destruction. In fact, the one tidbit most Elder Scrolls fans know about Kvatch is that it was destroyed, because the city was created for the express purpose of being destroyed. It's trying to receive the benefits of denying the player content without doing any of the work. So for most people, instead of Kvatch being the city where they were mildly inconvenienced for a dramatic story, it's instead the place where the Oblivion Gate starts spawning and has this weirdly unfinished quest to reclaim the castle. I believe Kvatch is relying on the player being familiar with the other cities to function dramatically, which doesn't work for the players who just follow the compass. If the player goes straight from the Imperial City sewers to Wayne and Priory to Kvatch, they never actually encounter any of the normal cities of Cyrodiil. Simply put, there's no angle where the destruction of Kvatch really works, because either Bethesda was concerned players might be mildly annoyed at its destruction, or, more likely, they just didn't have the time to fully realize the city. Todd Howard himself stated there was a questline to become the Duke of Calovia that would start here, at Kvatch, which was cut because, quote,
"It really defocused the main quest from dealing with the Daedra."
That, and getting the game out in 2006 to the console market. If Bethesda couldn't finish the City of Such, then yeah, of course Kvatch was just left to smolder. It's a city that was doomed from the start. Something is immediately wrong if you attempt to fast travel to Kvatch, as it's the only city to not allow you to go straight to its gate.
Daedra overran Kvatch last night!
It's a kind of quantum last night. No matter how long you delay arriving at the city, you'll always be too late. And inversely, no matter how quickly you arrive at the city,
Hope is gone. The Imperial line is dead. The Covenant is broken. The enemy has won.
this guy will always know about the Emperor's death.
Good day.
I guess the Daedra didn't target the cell towers. Kvatch and the related quest to close the Oblivion Gate that sits in front of its door is always available to the player, even if they haven't visited Joffrey yet. So like me, you can actually do these quests out of order and get special dialogue when you deliver the amulet after closing the gate at Kvatch.
Yes, Kvatch.
I think it's a neat touch, if only because Bethesda could not engineer a situation where the player absolutely could not get to Kvatch without speaking to Joffrey first, without making the city itself. Our goal in the main quest is to rescue the illegitimate son of the Emperor, Sean Bean, from the city of Kvatch. If you do the quest early, the goal is to rescue the civilians from the Chapel of Akatosh, and if you do so, Sean will go down to the refugee camp with the others. But first, we have to take care of the Oblivion Gate. So, question. Why did the Daedra attack Kvatch?
Because it's an emotionally resonant moment, man.
And there's the fulcrum of Oblivion. The amount of information and capabilities of the Mythic Dawn and Mehrunes Dagon is near omniscient when convenient in order to drive the plot. The Mythic Dawn assassins pursuing the Emperor into the sewers in such numbers is a stretch, but it makes sense they could at least find the Emperor in the Imperial City. The Daedra tracking down the illegitimate heir to the Septim dynasty and then deciding that a full-scale invasion of the city was preferable to an infiltration and assassination is dissonant. He's a priest, guys. He wouldn't see it coming or be able to stop you. They used a cruise missile to kill a rodent and then failed. And then the bulk of Daedra forces left, closed the Great Gate and 2 of its supporting gates, and left a single Oblivion gate open, but not to actually accomplish anything. The Daedra just sort of stand around and look menacing for the benefit of the player. We'll come back to this point later. Now, spoilers for later, but in the interim, when the player leaves the Amulet of Kings at Wayne Priory to fetch Martin, the Mythic Dawn will attack the Priory and steal the amulet. Before I ask how they knew, we can figure out the Mythic Dawn may have been tailing the player. It's only an unreasonable assumption if the player doesn't immediately deliver the amulet. It might have been neat if there were sporadic Mythic Dawn attacks until the player finishes the quest, so if the Dawn is tailing the player, then a possible direction to take the story is that the player is by proxy responsible for the destruction of Kvatch. Or you could be lazy and say a Mythic Dawn agent had infiltrated the Priory. It just seems like your priorities are backwards when you send the assassins to kill an emperor and an army to kill a priest. I mean, sure, they couldn't open an Oblivion gate when the emperor was still alive, Amulet of Kings and all that, but why not plop down a gate at Wayne Priory? Is it because we're not opening gates on such petty targets? Is Wayne Priory and the Amulet of Kings less important than the middle of the woods? Moving on, now we have to take care of the Oblivion gate itself. Kvatch has a unique Oblivion gate, which is an odd statement by itself because Morrowind had moved away from procedural generation, so everything was unique. While the gates you encounter in the world are not procedurally generated, they are randomized to be one of 7 presets. There are 4 more handcrafted worlds, all of which are tied to the main quest. Everything else in Oblivion is handcrafted. The minimum you have to do in Oblivion to complete the main quest is 3 out of the 60 that can appear in 90 potential locations. Most of the time, the forces of Oblivion will park a gate down in the middle of the wilderness and hop out, doing not much of anything. The player can ignore these gates and come back to them later to see that the Daedra are still doing nothing. There are also places where the player will see multiple gates within spitting distance of each other, the prime example usually being near Skingrad given how many times the player will travel near that city. These are issues that every single Oblivion critic brings up because it's very obviously a problem. One solution that was proposed in a livestream chat was that Daedric gates could focus on attacking generic and non-quest related forts and ruins, replacing their occupants for the duration of the main quest. Or there could be less wilderness gates and more village and city gates, with consequences for not doing those when you see them. Of course, the next problem is Oblivion itself. Oblivion, as a dungeon area, is universally hated. You might get the odd contrarian who defends the premise of Oblivion, but very few people will go up to bat for its execution. The only time I enjoyed doing an Oblivion gate was when I popped a new Doom song in the background and pretended I was a modern Pelennor Whitestrake. What you don't seem to understand is, Nirn isn't your world to conquer. With 50 random gates in the world sharing 7 preset designs, if you decide to take down all gates by hand, you'll likely encounter each design around 7 times. The variation between these designs is sparse, with the towers all being copy-pastes of each other. The reason the towers are, where underground ruins aren't, is that the towers supposedly have to conform to realistic dimensions since they're above ground. Now, given this is Oblivion, and especially given this is the Daedric Prince of Change's plane of Oblivion, this isn't actually true, and there were a lot of opportunities to make Oblivion more unique than the overworld dungeons. I mean, it's in the name of the game. And several of the Daedric quests involve going to Oblivion, yet every variation of Oblivion ends up being the same hellish Deadlands area. First, the overworld. This is the best part of Oblivion, being the only dungeons to generally involve exterior skyboxed cells. You'll encounter towers that spit fireballs at you, magic landmines, even plants that try to poison or slash you. It's awesome. And that isn't counting the Daedric occupants. They suffer in some regards. Daedra and Morrowind were always higher tier threats, even scamps merited caution until around level 7. However, the expectation is that the player may be completing the gate at Kvatch at level 1, so the enemies have to be leveled to be beatable. This starts with stunted scamps and Clanfear runts, which for most players were simply so threatening that they overwhelmed the Kvatch guard. They stand side by side with generic Dremora enemies who have traded in their impressive and powerful Daedric armor for weaker and leveled Dremora armor that can't be taken off their bodies. At some point in Oblivion Gates, you'll encounter the Oblivion Caves, arguably the most miserable variety of cave you can find in the entire game. And then there are the towers, which have the same beginning, middle, and end for every single Oblivion gate in the entire game. I'm sure the original design document there was something about a joint invasion effort that might have the player visiting various realms of Oblivion, hence the name of the game is Oblivion and not Deadlands. Maybe a Four Horsemen motif with Mehrunes Dagon, Molag Bal, Peryite, and I guess Namira would be the closest thing to famine. Instead, we got a game focusing on the intricacies of the Daedra, where most people just write off Mehrunes Dagon as Satan and Oblivion gates as hell you get to go through in the Eye of Sauron. This is Menion Goneld. This character shows up once in Oblivion and then disappears forever. He exists to tell us how to close the gate. He cannot be rescued, as he will insist on closing the gate first, resigning himself to whatever fate that will bring him. You can't even tell him that the city needs as many guards as they can get and that he should endeavor to return home alive. Nope, just a pointless sacrifice that is supposed to come off as heroic. We go up to the Sigil Keep. I detailed the Sigil Stones already. They apparently serve as anchors for the gate, and conveniently, instead of just being trapped inside of Oblivion after closing the gate, we get deposited outside. That's pretty much the only heroic aspect of what we, or Menion, were trying to accomplish, and once we know taking the Sigil Stone allows you to escape, then what we're doing is really no different than any normal Marauder or Necromancer cave, because, well, there's no way to get stuck inside Oblivion. With the way into the city clear, we asked the acting guard captain to accompany us into the city. After one fight, we group up with the survivors in the Chapel of Akatosh, and they are allowed to escape. Now, there is more to this quest, but our part relating to the main quest is done for now. We meet Brother Martin, and I looked into it. Martin and Joffrey are the only people in Oblivion referred to with the brother honorific, something that rarely shows up in Elder Scrolls and hasn't since Redguard. Except with Joffrey it makes sense, given that he's living in a monastic order. Martin is the only member of the actual Church of the Nine Divines to hold such a title, and given the rather easy connections between Mehrunes and Satan, it's not hard to see why. Never mind him being a priest of Akatosh would surely be enough to convey that Martin is a good guy, or that Martin allies with us against the forces of hell, or that Martin suggests we give our attention to the needy of Kvatch instead of him. None of that really conveys Martin is a good guy until we slap that little brother down there. We explain the situation to Martin. He's bummed about the Divines and their plan to destroy the city, even though that is how God is typically characterized, and the Nine Divines aren't generally characterized as having any kind of omniscient plan laid out for their subjects. Still, our honesty in having closed the giant Hell Gate means that Martin is willing to trust us and meet with Joffrey. Not that there's any other approach, like lying to him or telling him to get over himself. Nope, we just tell him that determinism is silly and not a valid excuse for being evil, and he comes along with us to Wayne Priory, which, as I said, is currently under attack by the forces of the Mythic Dawn. Why not plop down one of those gates you were going to use to molest a local wildlife to instead wipe out this monastery of undercover Blades agents?
Out of my way! I'd once fondled a deer, and I'll do it again.
I suppose I haven't really focused on the Mythic Dawn.
Truth is, the Legion doesn't know who was behind the Emperor's murder. We've already ruled out the Dark Brotherhood.
How?
So is this something worse?
Come on, Mythic Dawn is printed on the robe. Surely it can't be that hard to figure out. Their beliefs will come under scrutiny later. Right now, we're just looking at their basic exterior. Their movements and numbers are mysterious, but they all seem to be wearing these red robes and using magic to bind full sets of armor. It's a cool trick, likely inspired by custom enchanted items people made in Morrowind that did that effect. It's a shame that they're wasted on these satanic Hydra cultists.
Help! You must help! They're killing everyone at Wayne Priory. I don't know. I think they're right behind me. Prior Mabarel is dead!
We go and bail out Joffrey at the chapel and then go and recover the Amulet of Kings because the plot would be over if people kept taking their brain medicine. But it's missing, oh no.
We gained Uriel's heir and lost the Amulet of Kings.
We set out on horseback to Cloud Ruler Temple. There's something cosmically hilarious about passing an Imperial legionary who's already gotten word of our heroics at Kvatch, whilst being tailed by the heir to the throne and Grandmaster of the Blade.
It's you! The hero of Kvatch.
Only an Elder Scrolls game can engineer such a beautiful moment. Of course, you could just fast travel to Cloud Ruler Temple, as the game not only unlocks that point on the map, but discovers it for you as well. The hidden fortress of the Blades, yeah, sure. It's a shame too, as getting there from Wayne Priory involves one of the more interesting roads in the game. We arrive, Martin makes an awkward speech to the Blades, and Joffrey offers to induct us into his order. I decline, go off to do the Mages Guild, and return in full ebony armor with the ebony blade in hand. I don't think I need the katana, but thanks. Being a part of the Blades is optional in Oblivion and only comes with the benefit of being allowed to take their stuff and sleep in their beds. But it's not actually a faction. Granted, it was only technically a faction in Morrowind as well. Once we continue on the main quest, Joffrey dispatches us to meet with Boris, who had been doing field work in the Imperial City. Given the Blade's prominence as a spy organization, you would think there would be a dozen agents filling this role, and hundreds in the canonically upscaled Imperial City. Funny thing is, the Mythic Dawn does actually have sleeper agents, many more than the Blades do. So we meet with Boris and he gives us some simple instructions.
I'm going to get up in a minute and walk out of here. That guy in the corner behind me will follow me. You follow him. I will follow you. Remember, I've trained for this kind of follow thing my whole life, so don't f it up. Listen, I'm going to get up in a minute and walk out of here. That guy in the corner behind me will follow me. You follow him.
Astav Wyrick, whose one package is to sit and read his book until this very moment, stands up and follows Boris into the basement to assassinate him. Boris, I hope you aren't wondering how your cover keeps getting blown, considering you walk around proudly displaying your katana. We kill Wyrick, grab his book, and chat with Boris.
What? They took it from Joffrey? Things are worse than I had thought.
You didn't know Joffrey had it, unless you and him have been communicating using illegal teleportation magic. Anyways, the book is the Mythic Dawn Commentaries Volume 1. Boris suggests we head over to the Arcane University and speak with Tarmina, since she is apparently
supposed to be an expert on Daedric cults.
Yeah, no, I've worked with her before. She's barely suited to being a librarian, let alone an actual specialist. You may be wondering how the player who hasn't joined the Arcane University is supposed to meet her at the Mystic Archives, and the answer is you don't. Because Bethesda couldn't come up with a way to give the player a guest pass, she'll sit in the Archmage's lobby instead, having received another one of those illegal teleporting messages notifying her of our arrival. She, of course, doesn't know much, as they are a secretive cult, other than that their leader is Mankar Cameron. The Mythic Dawn isn't secretive at all, or really any more secretive than any other Daedric cult. Maybe the implication is that they're secret because their shrine is in a cave, whereas most Daedric shrines are in the open. Really, I suspect she's saying as much because that's the extent of her knowledge and we're her boss, and she doesn't want to look unprepared for something she is supposed to know.
You have a scholarly interest in Daedric cults, then?
Are you serious? The Order of the Black Worm, the Necromancer's Moon, the Revenant, Black Soul Gems, Metamarco, any of this ringing a bell, Tarmina? I might be interested because it's my job as the continent's magical regulator supreme to know this kind of stuff. She gives us the book's alternative name, Commentaries on the Mysterium Xarxes. At the very least, she actually gives us the second volume instead of making us search the library. From there, she refers us over to the first edition, a bookshop in the Market District, to try and find volumes 3 and 4, as they're exceedingly difficult to find.
You must be referring to Mankar Cameron's Commentaries on the Mysterium Xarxes. A common mistake.
No, Boris, Azan, Owen, Armand. Oh, we haven't done that one yet. Fentius mentions that the third and fourth volumes are rare, but that he does happen to have a copy of the third volume on hand, awaiting someone to pick up their online order, so he can't give it to us. He even goes so far as naming the person who's coming up to pick up the book. Like, what?
I don't know him personally.
Well, you have awfully loose lips, all things considered. We're not even given a chance to read the book before Gwyneth arrives, or try to copy some notes down, or to offer a higher price, as there's an intended sequence we have to follow, and because of that, Fentius is not only as knowledgeable about the series as Tarmina, Arcane University Daedric cult expert, but willing to taunt us with the fact that we have to politely ask Gwyneth for the book. I'll point out here the missed opportunity to have time pass as you read books. It means all the coffee table books are basically worthless given the possibility of using them to pass time waiting for NPC patterns. Now, we do actually have the option of stealing the book from Fentius. However, to progress the quest, we still have to talk to Gwyneth, because he has a note we need in order to get the fourth volume. In addition, this option isn't really apparent, as Gwyneth is scripted to arrive shortly after our conversation with Fentius, so it seems like Fentius would obviously suspect us of stealing the book. Gwyneth grabs the book, and we follow him outside. We can actually do a disposition check to buy the book off him for 100 gold. However, two things. Gwyneth is actually from Valenwood, and traveled across the continent to come pick this book up, so the idea of someone cracking a couple jokes and convincing him to part with the book, especially for so little money, is silly. However, we also have to still get the note from him, which we can technically steal or loot off his corpse, but so could the book. Ultimately, the path of last resort is to simply talk to Gwyneth, which always ends in us getting our hands on the book and note without any other requirement, making it the only real choice. He isn't willing to part with the book or note until we accuse the Dawn of being the assassins behind the Emperor's death. From the way he talks, the hero of Kvatch strikes me as kind of a moron. He actually thinks making an accusation of criminal cult behavior would affect a cult initiate, and don't say something like,
"Well, it worked, didn't it?"
Because yeah, it does. That doesn't make it all right. The note details that Gwyneth was to meet someone named the Sponsor in order to receive the 4th volume. Now, we could go do this without Boris, but 1, absolutely not, and 2, Boris will eventually track us down anyways. He can help us as we fight our way through the sewers. The Imperial City does have a full sewer system, but thankfully Bethesda learned from Tribunal to not set all of its quests inside it.
I happen to know that if you go up the stairs there, you can get a vantage point on the meeting room.
Boris, how much of your brain is occupied by knowledge of the Imperial City sewer system? We're given 2 options at this juncture, which is important as Boris has been flagged as non-essential. Oh yeah, essential flags. Up to this point I've mentioned them, but I haven't really explained them. When an NPC is flagged as essential, they cannot be killed. While this is common in a lot of games, arguably most games, Morrowind allowed the player to kill every NPC they wanted and would inform the player if the NPC they killed was considered essential to the main quest. Now, the next argument goes something like this.
NPCs in Oblivion are more dynamic than Morrowind NPCs, so they need to be essential because it's possible they may get killed while doing their routine, and that would be sad face, crying emoji.
This ignores the fact that essential could just mean that NPCs can't be killed by other NPCs or falling damage or drowning, but only the player dealing a lethal amount of damage. The other big argument is that being able to kill any NPC in the game would break quest sequences.
Oh, my dear. I didn't mean to imply that you have a choice.
Really, the only decent argument I've heard against my proposal is that the player might accidentally land a fatal blow on an NPC and have to reload their save. However, this potential stroke of bad luck is a small price to pay in order to preserve the freedom of killing any NPC in the game. In fact, the Thieves Guild already has consequences for killing certain NPCs, a feature we'll talk about when we get there. Ultimately, it's a design philosophy that made the questlines of Oblivion so rigid that murdering a single NPC could ruin the entire questline. In Morrowind, if you botched a quest by killing the wrong person, you still had other potential paths through the faction. Even then, you had quests like Miro Hilano's Slanders, which accounted for the possibility of the player killing someone despite being directed to do otherwise, which was a disposition penalty and a lack of reward. And ultimately, Morrowind's quests were flexible enough as to usually only break if the person murdered was the quest giver themselves. A benefit of their simplicity, perhaps, but New Vegas proved that you could do a rigidly structured quest without taking away the player's ability to kill all but one NPC in the game. It's not fair to compare Oblivion to how a later game did an idea, sure, but it is fair to say that the possibility does exist, and that the lack of exploration into player choice, in regards to murder, reflects on the 2006 launch date. I will say, however, that Oblivion is actually better than Skyrim in this front. In Skyrim, it's common to kill random NPCs only for them to be knocked down because you haven't completed their side quest. In Oblivion, many side quest NPCs can actually be killed beforehand, and this simply fails that side quest. What's funny is that Skyrim was the game to add the protected flag, which operates pretty much exactly how I proposed. Don't bother deleting your comment, I can still read them. At 10% max health, these NPCs enter a bleed-out state, just like essential NPCs, and will be ignored by AI in combat, but can still be killed by the player. There are 2 problems. One is that there are still so many essential NPCs in Skyrim that you run into that you may not even realize that there's a distinction. I think it was on my 3rd playthrough of Skyrim when I accidentally shot a fireball at some downed companion and killed them by accident, and even then I shrugged the incident off as some mod I was using. The other problem is that there are still essential NPCs in Skyrim. Most of the time, protected flags are used to simply prevent certain NPCs who are targets of assassination from dying early, or keeping your companions alive. So I thought I would bring it up because yes, I am aware. Boris is no longer essential, so if the meeting goes south, he may die in the process. This will prevent him from appearing in later quests, and there is some free training tied to his survival. I wish that, in Bethesda's limited capacity to allow the player to kill NPCs, that they had included more opportunities like this to focus on saving lives. Boris tells us that he should meet with the sponsor, having been trained for this. He can, however, be convinced to allow us to meet with the sponsor instead. Let's change this a little bit. Add this Speechcraft 3335 thing here, add a Fame 20 there. Maybe if you're feeling sexy, we could put in a thing where if Boris's disposition is low, he'll actually recommend the player handle the meeting themselves. What are those? Well, skill checks. Morrowind had a moment like this in its main quest, and that should have been a prelude to Oblivion being full of them.
So, you want to become one of the chosen of Mehrunes Dagon. The path of dawn is difficult, but the rewards are great. I have the book you seek. With it and the Master's 3 other books, you will possess the key to enlightenment. But I told you to come alone! Brothers, kill them!
Whatever happens at the meeting, a pair of Mythic Dawn members will head out on a vantage point and either spot the player or recognize Boris as a Blades member, and a fight will break out. There's technically a peaceful resolution if you immediately steal the book and leave, although I think that's an exploit. If he survives, Boris leaves for Cloud Ruler Temple, leaving the player to figure out the rest of the quest line. There's a puzzle in the 4 volumes that the player has to figure out, which is a fairly easy cryptography challenge, but is a surprising amount of trust Bethesda has in the player's ability to figure out a just go ask Tarmina. A day later, she'll tell you to go look at the first word of each paragraph. Before that, let's talk about the commentaries. In the base game of Oblivion, they are some of the few contributions of Michael Kirkbride, concept artist starting with Daggerfall and lorebook writer starting with Redguard. Unlike the other writers, Kirkbride has a fairly detailed list of all of the materials he wrote for the series, likely due to his current status as having been the guy solely responsible for Elder Scrolls writing. In any respect, after having written the 36 Lessons of Vivec for Morrowind, the commentaries seem to be the Oblivion version. So it's only fitting they are only an eighth of the size as the 36 Lessons and less interesting to boot. Honestly, the only comprehensible part of the series is the puzzle. The 36 lessons actually read like lessons, while the commentaries read like an Imperial Library dictionary of lore terms and ideas being dumped out onto the pages as Kirkbride hurries to complete the book before security removes him from the building. The books are written by Mankar Cameron, a fact so transparently obvious it really doesn't even bear mentioning, yet both Tarmina and Fentius do so, as it can really be assumed that most players aren't going to read the books. Cameron gives some clues at his story and ideology, but it's caked in so much symbolism as to be meaningless, probably intentionally so. For example, every quarter has known us, and none bore our passing except with trembling. Perhaps you came to us through war, or study, or shadow, or the alignment of certain snakes. Though each path matters in its kind, the prize is always thus. Welcome, novitiate. That you are here at all means that you have the worthiness of kings. Seek thy pocket now and look. There is the first key, glinting with the light of a new dawn. You can probably easily draw out some meaning from that. Every quarter would refer to the 4 corners of Tamriel, but also to the next line, which refers to the 4 playstyles of Oblivion, which would also exist in the ranks of the Mythic Dawn. What it almost feels like, and this isn't actually that unreasonable given what happens in the main quest, is that when the player pretends to join the Mythic Dawn, the player could potentially decide to stick around. This was something that was alluded to in Morrowind with the 6th house, but not fully realized in the final product. Perhaps Kirkbride hoped that the Mythic Dawn would remedy that, but was again not fully realized. Something to be noted is the extreme similarities between the main quests of Morrowind and Oblivion, something I'll go into more detail later. The puzzle is the first letter of each word highlighted for an easy solution. Green Emperor Way, where tower touches midday sun. You may need Tarmina to know that Green Emperor Way refers to the Palace District, since the map itself refers to the area as the, Palace District. Anyways, at noon you walk around, looking for clues, and find a map glowing on the tomb of Prince Camaril. As Tarmina says,
the commentaries are contemporary with Tiber's Septim, over 400 years ago.
This means that this tomb has been glowing red and pointing at a spot in Cyrodiil every day at prime garden walking time for 433 years, and no one ever thought to go check that out. People see the wrong symbol on a building and assume child predators are involved. I don't need to tell you that they would be all over this. The only explanation I can come up with is that the tomb is enchanted to only glow when the 4th commentary volume is near it, and no. The tomb glows every day at noon for like 40 minutes. Every single year in Tamriel is 365 days, no leap day. That's 158,045 times this symbol has glowed red, and not one curious guard ever reported this strange phenomenon. It's on the main path of the graveyard. It faces outwards towards the path. Hell, the map and Mythic Dawn symbol are literally carved into the tomb. There's the main point, sure, but what are the other points? They seem to point directly at Bruma, Coral, Skingrad, and Kvatch. 3 of those cities are tied to the main quest, but not Skingrad, and Coral only superficially via Wayne Priory. The best explanation I can come up with, and this is not an often discussed topic, is that the symbol only glows if a person who is written in the Mysterium Xarxes, even retroactively, approaches it, and a person is written in the Xarxes if they read the first volume of the commentaries. But even that falls apart because that's the volume the Mythic Dawn publishes to try and recruit new members, so it would be the most read. That rule would only be viable if it applied to the 4th volume, which it doesn't. Maybe then the explanation is that Cameron or Dagon decides who sees the map. However, Cameron would absolutely not give that power to the player. Dagon might, if you stay up all night thinking about how Dagon would be seeking to usurp Cameron now that he's the status quo, and stop. Got a hit of that metaphysics yet? It's very easy to fall into the wormhole of filling in the blanks for Bethesda. Who is Prince Camaril, other than his elven name we know nothing about him, or his significance to the map? The only reason might be because the garden was full of Ayleid tombs and that's what Cameron had to tag, but then why is it still around? The map points to a cave at Lake Aureus. Now the obvious thing to do would be to report to Joffrey and gather forces to lead an assault on the cave in order to reclaim the Amulet of Kings.
Good work locating the Shrine of Dagon. If you can retrieve the Amulet of Kings, we may yet prevail.
I had to go back to record that. See, Oblivion hurts to play with your brain on, so some of these hypotheticals I propose after the fact. I didn't actually go back to the temple because I didn't play Oblivion with my brain fully switched on. That said, really, Joffrey? Here's the thing. Recording a single line to acknowledge a player choice isn't really embracing player choice. Boris, who will insist on doing the infiltration part when you acquire the volumes, won't volunteer to assist you with this quest, and you obviously can't get the help you need. Granted, the player is expendable since they aren't actually the chosen one in this story, even though they are still valuable. I just feel like Joffrey should have a bit more to say than 2 generic sentences like, "I know we've asked a lot of you, but just a little farther, and we'll have gotten the Amulet of Kings. You've proven yourself an apt agent thus far. I trust you can do this." Something that acknowledges the necessity of the player doing it by themselves. So we head to the cavern and are greeted by Harrow, or rather, a generic doorkeeper. The doorkeeper only exists because someone couldn't figure out how to despawn a rock in front of the door to keep players from getting in the cave early. So, cut the doorkeeper and have us just get greeted by Harrow. Harrow is a dumb name. I'm going to decide that they used it as a placeholder and it stuck, and not that they decided to actually use a synonym for distress as a character name. Yeah, it fits the motif, just some small mercy, please. Harrow takes all our stuff. It's surprising how derivative each game's story was, given how the Thalmor Embassy infiltration is a better version of this quest premise. Granted, we get all of that stuff back minutes later, defeating the benefits of a quest that separates a player from their equipment. We can, of course, say no, and doing so twice will blow our cover. Nice touch, in my opinion. At least the player has the option of being belligerent or attempting to fit in. We journey to the shrine proper, where Mankar Cameron's given a pep talk to his middle management team.
"When I walk the earth again, the faithful among you shall receive your reward, to be set above all other mortals forever."
Neil Todd.
You gotta put that in.
Smile.
You tell me if I'm overdoing it, won't you?
We see our target, the Amulet of Kings, dangling around Cameron's neck. He leaves, which I'm not going to go on a rant about player choices. There's plenty of magical explanations for this scene, and now we're stuck having joined the Mehrunes Dagon cult. Our player decides the only thing to do, then, would be to steal the only thing of value in the shrine, which is the Mysterium Xarxes. Yeah, it's just sitting there at the altar. We're told to take up the sacrificial dagger and offer some red drink to the statue, and the dagger's sitting right next to the Xarxes. Apparently, the lesson the game is trying to teach us is that stealing a copy of Oblivion will make people very angry. The sheer amount of material written on the ensuing fight says a lot about how most people build their characters and play Oblivion, which is heavily dependent on gear rather than skill or attribute levels. Granted, I have a home field advantage having been trained in both Conjuration and Hand-to-Hand, and the Atronex sign helps with all the incoming magic. Once we take down Harrow, the guy holding onto our gear, we're golden. Now, before we leave, there is a topic of Julius, the guy we're supposed to sacrifice. I usually save him, although this time he perished. He offers some free skill boosts to alchemy, restoration, and mysticism should he survive, although that itself is its own challenge. When we grab the Xerxes, the Dagon statue collapses on top of Julius, usually killing him. We can preemptively free him, but that itself starts the fight. I enjoy that playing the hero and absolutely saving everyone is an added challenge with its own rewards. It really helps with making the player feel like an actual hero for going above and beyond, instead of most other times where we're just the hero because we ticked off some boxes. The Mythic Dawn is even joinable as a faction. Granted, it's a bit weird. If you talk to the doorkeeper and trigger the part of the quest where you're in the faction and then immediately leave before speaking to Harrow, you're effectively a member of the Mythic Dawn. Your relationship with the Blades will take a disposition hit, and you'll gain a disposition bonus with all the Mythic Dawn members out in the world, as well as a couple unique lines of dialogue. The player will also scream a voice line along the lines of, "For Lord Dagon," but only certain races and genders that have recorded lines and only when you power attack. This is likely an oversight as to how those lines were scripted, rather than an intentional feature of the faction. The whole faction screams oversight, as you can't actually leave the cave if you go through the initiation ritual. It's curious people like to discuss theories about joining the 6th house in Morrowind, but researching this video was the first time I had even heard about actually joining the Mythic Dawn, which is more feature complete than the 6th house as a faction ever was. And really, that draws onto an interesting topic of how derivative this questline is to Morrowind's main questline. That might seem like a good thing, but in all honesty, a lot of the pieces that made Morrowind's main quest work as well as it did are missing in Oblivion. Morrowind's main quest can be divided into 3 sections. The first 6 quests relate to intelligence gathering, meeting various contacts and performing favors in exchange for information on the Nerevarine prophecy and cult, as well as the 6th house. This entails meeting with 6 different informants, as well as later meeting the leadership of an Ashlander tribe. Oblivion starts somewhat similarly. Despite its bombastic introduction, its first act can be described as the same intelligence gathering format, this time with the Mythic Dawn. However, Oblivion deviates by establishing the Mythic Dawn as an existential threat from the very first moment. And by the second quest, they have destroyed a city and killed the Septim lineage. In addition, the Mythic Dawn are not as complex an enemy as the 6th house, and much of the necessary prophecy information is already known to the Blades and explicitly told to the player, without having even earned the trust of Joffrey yet, as though this information gets published in the Black Horse Courier. Morrowind's second act begins with a mission to eliminate a 6th house base. This begins the player down the path of directly interacting with the 6th house and fulfilling the 7 trials that mark the player as the Nerevarine. In turn, Oblivion's second act begins with a mission to eliminate a Mythic Dawn base in order to track down an item necessary for fulfilling a ritual that would close shut the jaws of Oblivion. When the player returns the Mysterium Xerxes to Cloud Ruler Temple, they will eventually be dispatched to collect a series of items in order to use the Xerxes to open a portal to Mankar Cameron's personal realm of Oblivion. Morrowind's third act begins after the player meets Vivek. It's short, and I detailed its problems in the relevant video. Oblivion attempts to correct the shortcomings of the third act. We'll get to it. The problem is that because the conflict between the Blades and Mythic Dawn is so much more simple than the conflict between the Ashlanders and Tribunal Temple, it lacks any of the intrigue necessary to make the plot interesting. Oblivion instead has to rely on emotionally resonant moments to keep the player entertained. Before we can get to doing important stuff, Martin sends us to Joffrey, as the game can't justify Martin knowing what the first piece of the ritual would be within seconds of getting his hand on the Xerxes. Strangers have been spotted on the road leading to Cloud Ruler Temple, and Joffrey needs someone to flush them out. This quest is actually somewhat important and interesting in establishing the stakes for Oblivion's second act, and a lot of people miss that. The Blades can't and won't extend themselves from the temple to hunt down the Mythic Dawn scouts, and the Mythic Dawn can't just materialize a portal wherever they want. This quest also establishes the Bruma City Guard, who play a big part in the coming quests. Captain Stefan of the Blades will tell us that the spies have been spotted by the Runestone at dusk. We head over to Bruma as Joffrey suggested, and...
Go ahead. I'm Captain Bird, commander of the Bruma Guard. Except for Gerald coming back from a trip down south, things are pretty quiet. Not much travel right now with the Oblivion crisis.
Never was. Bird won't be much help unless you take the only lead he offers offhandedly, that Ural has returned from down south recently. So we break into their house, and there Ural's sleeping during the day, so I can easily break into her basement without drawing attention. A Dunmer woman is sleeping down there, next to her copy of the first edition of the Commentaries of the Mythic Dawn. Not exactly interesting reading material. I guess it's for recruiting new members. Anyways, Faram freaks out and we put her down. It is neat that the spies who operate at night were given packages to sleep during the day. It would have been very easy to forget about that detail. Okay, so problem. An actual sleeper agent probably would have tried to implicate us as a trespasser rather than blowing their cover. Although there's enough damning evidence here to expose them as Mythic Dawn agents, the law isn't exactly on our side. Even if we do find a note both implicitly naming the homeowner and detailing the Mythic Dawn's plan to destroy Bruma in order to assault Cloud Ruler Temple and kill Martin. So, we find a cavern which leads out of the city towards the runestone, murder Ural in her sleep, and report back to Joffrey. It's a shame the player can't steal the orders, report back to Joffrey, and then attempt to arrest the two for interrogation. We shouldn't have to rely on a clandestine organization like the Mythic Dawn making a mistake and leaving their evil plans just lying around for us to find. Unless the plan is a misdirection, but it's not. Joffrey tells us that he'll warn the Countess of the danger and sends us back to Martin.
Xerxes mentions 4 items needed for the ritual, but so far I have only deciphered one of them. The blood of a Daedra Lord.
Come on, man, it's just a simple substitution alphabet. Martin wants us to get our hands on any Daedric artifact. This is one of the more interesting quests due to how freeform it is and obviously requires some sacrifice on the part of the player in terms of their access to a Daedric item. If the player doesn't have one or know how to get one, Martin will point them at a book and tell them to read it to find out more. Said book points at the Shrine of Azura, which results in Azura's Star. A bad choice, and absolutely hilarious that Azura's Star is the artifact recommended for sacrifice to the player. Should the player somehow lose every Daedric artifact, starting this quest is a prerequisite for Hermaeus Mora's quest. That's a pretty serious artifact to have to lose, but you would have to make some serious mistakes along the way to reach the point where the player can actually softlock this quest. There are 15 potential items which can be used, and Martin has a unique line for each artifact. Martin has a revealing line if you give him the Sanguine Rose, for example.
I never thought to see this again. I once possessed it, briefly. A lifetime ago, it seems now. To obtain it, and then give it up. I honor your dedication to our cause.
Most of the lines, however, are fairly generic. Usually Martin comments that he or someone else will be thankful when the artifact is gone from the world, except Spellbreaker. Although Spellbreaker isn't really a Daedric artifact, as the book Tamriolic Lore by the last living dwarf Yagram Bagarn details, it was created by the godless Dwemer for the purposes of defending against Shalador's powerful magic. We'll be discussing the Daedra in more detail later, but for the purposes of video making, I used a console command to progress the quest. With an artifact in hand, we're sent to Joffrey, who informs us that an Oblivion gate has opened at Bruma. What? I beat 2 gates at Battlehorn Castle with a small regiment of retainers, surely the city guard can handle this. No, instead we have to go to Bruma and meet with Captain Byrd.
Thanks for coming. Since we had the hero of Kavach available, I didn't think it made sense to try this on our own the first time. We're ready when you are. Just say the word and we'll follow you into that hell-spawned gate.
Why are we presenting it like an office worker passing a print job off to the guy who always handles the printer and not an invasion from hell that the fate of the world is staked on? Captain Byrd and his 2 men join us in the fray, and the gate is one of the 4 unique gates the player can do. Byrd's a bit spooked, and the 2 men only have names and dialogue, not in-game. Once you get the sigil stone, you show Byrd what to do. Save scum 1,000 times to get the stone you want, and return to Bruma. If you manage to exit the gate after 2 AM, Byrd comes out of the gate in his evening attire. Returning to Joffrey, he commends our job in instructing the Bruma Guard, but suggests we go out and try to raise a larger garrison for the city. The Allies for Bruma quest is actually optional, and the consequences for not doing it are rather minor. Still, I went along with the spirit of the game and did it anyways, but more on that in a bit. Martin will simultaneously give us a quest to retrieve the blood of a divine.
The second item is the counterpart to the first, the blood of a divine. This was a terrible puzzle to me. Unlike the Daedra Lords, the gods have no artifacts.
This is a major point of contention for the story, and it's amazing how much of the conversation comes down to people just making stuff up. We are directed to Joffrey, who gives us the location of the armor of Tiber Septim. Martin says,
"You can reassure Joffrey that I will not destroy the armor. All I need is a scraping of Talos's divine blood."
A lot of people have taken this statement to mean that Martin will use actual dried blood that's caked onto the armor. However, this strikes me as off. Sure, you could come to the conclusion that the old blades wanted to preserve the armor as is, but you could also come to the conclusion that the armor would have been preserved in a pristine, clean state. After all, Tiber Septim, for unstated reasons, decided to seal the armor inside of Sancre Tor in the 36th year of his reign despite ruling for 81 years. Or maybe they're referring to his 38-year-long reign as Emperor of Tamriel. I guess it would be after, since the tomb was haunted by the Underking, which is why it's sealed. If it was at the end of his career, then surely he wouldn't have fought in it in a while, and it would have been cleaned off at some point. Now, Sancre Tor was an ancient Riemann city. However, Tiber Septim saw it as strategically unimportant and left it to rot. Two significant events occurred here. Tiber Septim met the armies of Skyrim and High Rock at Sancre Tor and used the Thu'um to defeat them, and then recovered the Amulet of Kings from the corpse of Emperor Riemann III. Look, I have 20 tabs open trying to answer the question of why Tiber Septim would bury his armor at Sancre Tor, or if Martin means the scraping is a sliver of the armor or actual dried blood. If the latter, wouldn't a more prudent artifact to find be the dagger that was used to slit Tiber Septim's throat, which prevented his use of the Thu'um, considering the blood could instead belong to someone Tiber bested in battle? More to the point, the Aedra do have artifacts. The armor of the Divine Crusader are all Aedric artifacts, or at the very least are as close to Aedric artifacts as Spellbreaker and Volendrung are to Daedric. Same thing with the Brush of True Paint, which is in the base game, or Ariel's Bow. Ultimately, this quest signifies a larger problem, which is the complete and utter clusterfuck that is lore pertaining to Tiber Septim. Now the thing is, Bethesda had pinned down that the Elder Scrolls IV would be set in Cyrodiil during the production of Morrowind. Maybe they weren't sure they would get to make the game, but if they did, that's where it was going to be. So, more than likely, the idea was that Oblivion was going to settle once and for all that matter of Tiber Septim and the Empire, at least in a matter similar to how Morrowind settled characters like Vivec and Nerevar. And you would have stuff like the Remans with St. Alicia and Morahouse and the Akaviri, and even further back to the ancient Ayleids, Michael Kirkbride. That name is a flashbang thrown into the room of an Elder Scrolls lore discussion. Here's the thing. Kirkbride contributed quite a bit to Elder Scrolls lore, but he isn't its sole writer. Morrowind's main quest was instead written by Ken Rolston, who took a more hands-off approach when it came to Oblivion, passing the job to Kurt Coleman, a designer. Again, it's hard to point at which writers are responsible for exactly what material, like for instance, which particular designer was responsible for the quest to infiltrate the Mythic Dawn. However, it is fair to say that when it came to Oblivion, there was far less interest in putting Tiber Septim in a similar role to Nerevar. Oh, we learned all about Nerevar, all the different theories about his origin, his life, his death, his history, and his reincarnation. In comparison, we get table scraps for Oblivion. It might seem minor, but an easily missable piece of flavor text about when a door was sealed shut can cause a lot of anguish if you don't have someone filling a lore master position. Elder Scrolls didn't have any kind of official lore master until ESL, because it was the philosophy of the writing team behind these games that contradictions are not only natural, but even encouraged stylistically. The problem is that this is a story about the heroic end of the Septim dynasty. The Empire and its home, Cyrodiil, are the protagonists of the metatext, and while we do get a lot of new information with Oblivion, in terms of quests, we get next to nothing. The problem is that the writers believe that establishing any kind of objective information about Tiber Septim would ultimately undermine the intrigue of the character. People will spend hours discussing the Arcturian heresy, something that wouldn't happen if it turned out there was an official explanation to the story. However, the key difference is that Morrowind never answered the question of what really happened to Nerevar, while Oblivion never even tried to answer any of its questions. While the affairs of the empires of men are a big symptom of this, an even bigger symptom are the Ayleids. Their ruins dot the land of Cyrodiil, similar to how the Dwemer ruins existed across Vvardenfell. The difference is that the Dwemer played an integral part to Morrowind's main quest, while the Ayleids exist in about 9 lore books and a DLC. The heart of the conflict of Morrowind is the heart of Lorkhan, and what the Dwemer did to it. The player can actually piece together what happened, not in the game's main quest, but in the Mages Guild. There's even more context to this event in the main quest about the artifacts involved, the major players who supported it, even the opposition to Khagranak's proposal. The player even meets the last living dwarf during the course of the main quest. However, the Ayleids have absolutely zero presence in the base game of Oblivion, outside of their ruins. The Dwemer, a race of people who all collectively disappeared from existence millennia prior to the series, have more of a presence than the Ayleids, who got massacred during the rise of the Riemann Empire but still existed in small numbers until recently. Mind you, our next quest is to visit an Ayleid ruin. This is their shot. And this is the UESP's page on a detailed breakdown of this quest. A fairly standard Iliad ruin dungeon crawl ensues. That's what the Iliads are to people. They don't have cities, they have standardized dungeons. The extent of the Iliads' presence in the main quest is that we need a really big glowing rock made by them. There's not even a metaphor that Martin has to decipher, he just asks for a great welkin stone the same way one would ask for chicken nuggets. Years ago, I mentally inserted that Mankar Cameron is an Iliad king trying to restore his former empire, because at least that would make them relevant. But it's not even that. Mankar Cameron is hanging out in a pristine Iliad structure, I guess because he's an enthusiast of their architecture. The man is actually the descendant of a ruler of Valenwood who rebelled against a random Septim emperor. Granted, the Dwemer were a multi-game spanning mystery and the Iliads were a piece of flavor text. So it's easy to understand why the legacy of the Iliads wasn't a priority when it came to the writing. If the Remans weren't going to be part of the main quest, you can bet the Iliads definitely weren't. It all comes down to the fact that Bethesda had until March of 2006 to finish the game. Now, one might say that Bethesda had 4 whole years to make Oblivion, which just isn't how game development works. The team was expanded from about 40 developers to 70. The engine required various updates, such as support for full voice acting and an implementation of Havok physics. And then there's the matter that work on Oblivion did not start on May 2nd, 2002, and it did not end on March 19th, 2006. Games of the era had to go gold, meaning that the game had to be actually complete, playable, and bug-free months before release, so that the game could be physically printed, packaged, and shipped out for release day. Oblivion was also riding on the cusp of online patch distribution, so unlike the modern Bethesda standard, Oblivion had to not have any game-breaking problems that would cripple the game's success. Simply put, I think a lot of people are very charitable with the timetable that Bethesda was operating under. Kurt Coleman, for instance, details a moment where his initial E3 2005 demo at Fort Such was thrown out in favor of the sequence we ended up receiving at the last moment. And that's not the only cut content. The plans may have been to go harder with the plot elements, to explore all those aspects of the lore I talked about, but one fact ruled above all others. Is it time? I think it is. It's November of 2005 and the Xbox 360 has just released. Its only problem? Microsoft had only started production of the console a couple months prior and the shelves were already empty. By the end of the year, 900,000 units had shipped just in North America. Here's a list of all the Xbox 360 launch titles. There's some pretty good games on this list, but do you know what isn't here? The real thing that was selling 360s was the promise of Halo 3. Here's Bill Gates signing the first copy of Halo 3 ever sold because he knew full well in 20 hours 1 million people would be playing it on Xbox Live. Halo 2 was already a juggernaut. In its day, it was the record holder for the highest grossing video game. People were prepared to spend $300, even $400 on the promise that Halo 3 would be good. The only problem was that it was exactly that, a promise. Halo 3 would release in September of 2007, almost 22 months after the Xbox 360 launched. That 22-month gap between the launch of the console and the launch of the game is interesting. Chances are, if you were born around the new millennium, one of your favorite games came out in this 22-month time period. And chances are you know about it because of its success, because over 1 million people bought a console for a game that would come out almost 2 years later. How is this significant? Simple. Bethesda released Oblivion in March of 2006, only 4 months into that 22-month time period. Here's Peter Moore, Vice President of Worldwide Marketing and Publishing for Xbox. There's an unconfirmed report that this guy got a permanent tattoo to market the release date of Halo 2. He's standing on the stage of E3 2005, less than a year after Halo 2 set its record for making $125 million in one day. IGN would go on to claim that 6 million people followed just their coverage of this event. Here's what he has to say about Oblivion.
It promises to feature one of the largest open-ended worlds ever created for a video game. It also includes thousands of characters that are governed by groundbreaking AI. These characters eat, sleep, and complete tasks all around the clock. And they make their own choices based upon what's going on in the world around them. Welcome to the world of Oblivion.
What would follow would be Oblivion's trailer, showing little but hyping the game up. Todd Howard would follow that act during the conference with his presentation of the game. Kurt Coleman may have been annoyed that his E3 demo got the axe, but Todd Howard could see the bigger picture. Morrowind may have saved the company, but Oblivion was what made Bethesda worth $7.5 billion to Microsoft. Okay, that part's hyperbolic. Each step was important, but arguably there was no greater turning point in the story of Bethesda than these words.
Hi, I'm Todd Howard of Bethesda Softworks, and welcome to our demo of The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion.
Now, I want to finish my point before we get into the specifics of this gameplay demo. Bethesda didn't have their modern reputation. To the broader gaming audience, they weren't the studio known for action-adventure games with light RPG elements that are full of bugs and use an outdated engine. Most of the people who knew Bethesda had a history with bugs at the time were hardcore CRPG fans, and most people ignored that crowd. To the layperson, Bethesda was an up-and-coming studio with a unique idea that was pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Millions of people saw this demo, and with 18 months to Halo 3, millions of people got their hands on the game. This wasn't possible without two things: the Xbox copy of Morrowind, and the ease of which traditional PC developers could port games onto the hardware. But Morrowind wasn't even the prologue, just the foreword on the inner sleeve. To most Elder Scrolls fans, the story of Bethesda started with Oblivion on the Xbox 360. So let's watch that demo. It lasts about 20 minutes and can be divided into the following sections. A prologue where Bethesda sells the company to the public, then we get a prison sequence to show off Patrick Stewart, then Howard takes us to a forest, then into an Iliad ruin, then into a mine to show off the arrow physics, then to Quarrel where the Morrowind voice actor for the Dunmer and Imperials, Jeff Baker, has a conversation between his two different characters.
Rumor has it there has been an attack on Kvatch. They say the Daedra attack in great numbers.
Grave news indeed. Perhaps my axe can be of use.
Then we get the dog torture scene before ending the demo at the Battle of Kvatch. So, how much did Howard lie? Well, we start with such, which is honestly not that big a lie, as Howard states there would be 9 cities, and yeah, there are 9 cities in the game. Howard's caught in a massive lie, however, when he states,
"This is where the game starts, like our others, in prison."
Gosh, Daggerfall. An immediate and apparent difference between the demo and the launch release would have to be the brightness. That's not the brightness or gamma simply dropped to 0, as the high parts of the scene are much brighter than the low parts. It looks as though areas which aren't being directly illuminated are just straight up dark. In reality, this isn't what the demo looked like, as outsourcing my research revealed another copy of this demo footage with more even lighting that is fairly close to the game, so the version currently on YouTube makes things darker than it needs to be. Also, look at the shadows cast by the light as it swings, or the differences in the color of light based on the angle and location of the surface. As the Emperor comes down, you can hear that Boris's voice actor is actually Jeff Baker's old Imperial voice, and Wes Johnson's entire character isn't in the scene yet.
Off limits.
Usual mix-up with the watch.
Never mind. Stand back, prisoner. We won't hesitate to kill you if you get in our way.
Prisoner, stand away from the door. Over by the window, now.
I originally stated some of the Emperor's dialogue was cut from the intro for the game. The UESP claims the lines are supposed to play, but get interrupted during regular gameplay. It's one of those situations where that might have just been the way they cut out the dialogue for the sake of pacing. The sequence takes a little longer in the demo because they just stand there saying the dialogue, and it's absolutely unnecessary. Why would Uriel only now be realizing that he's inside the prison? Why would Renault clarify he's now under the Legion compound? It makes him seem like he has dementia, which doesn't match his actual characterization.
I know this place. The prison?
Yes, Your Majesty. Beneath the Legion compound. We're headed for a secret passage known only to the Blades. No one can follow us through here.
We go to the next part of the trailer where Todd shows off the forest, which wowed a lot of people.
This game looks unbelievable. It actually has trees, unlike Vardenfall.
Our staff spent some time at the University of Maryland Geology Lab studying how soil erodes, how rocks form, and how trees grow. We have the game create that for us.
Usually when building a scene like this, I start out by placing the rocks. I sort of look at the lay of the land, which is generated first, and then I try and pick out spots where a rock might naturally occur. I've got this big one here. So, I would just take a big rock like this and plop it down, sink it to an appropriate height, and then I'll go and add like little satellite rocks around it to try and create a feel that there's some natural erosion going on.
Oblivion was rather infamous as an early adopter of SpeedTree, a middleware program which could be used to easily generate foliage for forests. Here are some stats from the unofficial Oblivion patch's cell audit for various mistakes they've fixed related to trees. The number of trees partially or completely embedded in rocks, walls, trees, logs, or fences, 4,101. The number of trees partially or completely embedded underground, 1,055. Shrubs embedded in rocks, walls, trees, logs, or fences, 13,277. Shrubs embedded underground, 244. See through the underside of trees or shrubs, 3,883. See through the underside of rocks, 3,002. Rocks partially or completely embedded in walls, trees, logs, fences, or stairs, or completely embedded in other rocks, 11,252. Rocks completely embedded underground, 4,533. 103 flying trees, 698 flying shrubs, 549 flying rocks, including 6 at the canopy level of the forest. There's no point in screenshotting pictures of see-through or floating objects in Oblivion because there are many, dutifully patched by the unofficial Oblivion patch team. This is half a problem with the early implementation of SpeedTree. It wouldn't be used by so many game and movie studios if it had this high a failure rate today. The other half is Bethesda, assuming that procedural generation would be adequate for their world. One of the people in my Discord reached out to Noah Berry, one of the world artists featured in the Making of Oblivion documentary. He was kind enough to explain exactly how SpeedTree was implemented into Oblivion, explaining that SpeedTree randomizes elements of the shape of foliage in its placement, but that these elements are saved and imported into the construction set. SpeedTree was used to quickly populate the world with objects before world artists would go in and perform cleanup on areas like the shrines or dungeon entrances. Another tool was created to generate the initial height map, which the world artists would again modify to suit their needs, and he suggests that the bulk of the height map was hand-adjusted, and the height map editor would indeed erode the terrain. This is all Oblivion specific, as they would change the workflow and tools used by Fallout 3. My stream made a joke about how this guy was just justifying his job, but honestly, if he spent any time trying to fix all the broken trees, his job justified itself. However, it's the next line that perks my ear.
And it all animates with the weather.
In the demo, you see trees swaying in the wind. In the game, you see the leaves rotate slightly during a rainstorm. Only some of the trees in-game are affected by heavy rainstorms, let alone soft breezes. This is one of those areas where Howard made a promise he technically keeps, but we know it's an exaggeration. His next line is that Cyrodiil is 16 square miles, but half of that is procedurally generated forest. I can't verify the latter part, but apparently Cyrodiil is bigger than he promises, so good on him. He mentions the compass, and here we have Todd engaging in a prototypical Oblivion fight, missing several swings and blocking at wrong times, and generally appearing engaging while in reality it's just two dudes clicking on each other.
We've created an all-new combat engine that combines melee, defense, and magic into one system.
That new combat engine was actually just removed directional swings, removed hit chance, removed spell chance, and reworked a couple formulas. We spent a couple minutes killing things in the ruin. I'd say making the demo dungeon and Iliad ruin full of undead is surprisingly honest on the part of Todd Howard. He does overstate the relevance of the Varla stones, and we move on to the stealth demo. Most of what he says here is fairly accurate, although he does say,
there are no experience points.
He does 3-shot an ogre, which is outright deception. Next, Todd states there are, quote,
there are 9 main cities in the game and dozens of smaller settlements.
Let's count! Using a spreadsheet and a map, and later a page listing all of these areas to double check, I listed out everything that could be considered a settlement. Let's start with the first category. This is every multi-building area in Cyrodiil that isn't a stone's throw away from a larger city. There are 14 of them. 9 of them are considered villages, 4 of them buildings with an outhouse, and 1 temple area. Most of these areas only have 2 structures. Bleaker's Way is an outlier with 8 different buildings. Now we have 2 areas which have multiple buildings, but are close enough to a city to be considered a satellite settlement. These areas are Harlan's Watch and Wayne Priory. If we say that every multi-building settlement outside of a city walls are considered to be settlements, that brings the total up to 16, which is 8 short of the technical definition of dozens. Now, we're going to stretch the definition of a settlement. It's generally agreed upon by pedants everywhere that the term settlement refers to a plurality of buildings. However, the in-game Cyrodiil is not a one-to-one representation of the actual memetic Cyrodiil. In a sense, each person represents 10,000, and each building theoretically represents its own village. This loophole gets stretched with something like Mellus Petilius's house, which is just some guy living in the middle of the woods alone, and likely doesn't represent a village, but for the sake of argument, we'll count it. Here's all the single building areas that are not adjacent to a city. There are 20 of them, so Todd is hitting 36 settlements, even though over half of that count are single building farm areas, 4 houses, a couple chapels, and all of the inns located outside of the cities. That would make 3 dozen settlements, although I'm not sure that argument would hold much weight in an actual legal settlement if Bethesda were to be called out for false advertising. Remember, 2 of these 36 areas could be considered an extension of the city near them. Let's fill out the remaining areas, which are single building areas adjacent to cities. There are 12 single building structures located next to cities. Most of them are stables with a couple farms, a house, and a chapel. That brings the total count up to 48 areas outside of the 9 major cities, which could be considered with the scaling argument to be settlements, but 32 of those 48 settlements are actually single building structures. Now, it may be possible to say that it was Bethesda's intention to deliver upon the promise of dozens of settlements, but latent development suffered a cut. But if you actually look at the map, there's not really a whole lot more areas that settlements could fit into, at least at the current world scale, unless they're all like hack dirt in the middle of the woods. As to Todd's next line,
over 1,000 NPCs live in Oblivion, all with their own schedules and jobs.
Yeah, they fell a bit short. The UESP says there are 855 NPCs in base Oblivion. I'm not sure their methodology other than they don't count the generic NPCs like guards and bandits, who themselves don't really exist as characters other than the roles they perform, so they don't meet the mark of Howard's promise. Mind you that Peter Moore promised thousands, which was accurate for Morrowind at over 2,600 NPCs. We'll have more to say on this topic later. We move on to the conversation between Jeff Baker's 2 characters. The only deceptive thing about this conversation would be 2 random NPCs referring to each other by name, given that most NPC conversations tend to avoid using names to refer to each other to make the dialogue more general and thus more usable.
Let's head into this bookstore.
This is the rather infamous part of this demo where we went from stretching the truth and numbers to outright lies. In this section, Todd details a conversation with this woman that is completely disingenuous. You simply do not have interactions like this. The NPC then leads you upstairs and performs a set of actions that the player would be hard-pressed to find. Here's the thing. Radiant AI actually refers to an AI packaging system. However, it's inaccurate to say that the packages aren't scripted. These packages act similarly to functions, being called at various times with a set list of conditions and variables that can be tweaked by the designer. An example would be generic AI, which often uses a sleep package to direct the AI to locate a bed near them and sleep in it. This is essentially a function being called that searches for a bed and once it finds it, directs the AI to sleep in it. Now in fairness, most quote dynamic unquote systems are actually scripted if you do enough reductive boiling down. It's fair to say that Oblivion's system of having NPCs do this semi-dynamically is still leaps and bounds ahead of actually scripting an NPC out to, say, leave their desk and walk downstairs for a minute in an actual scripting language. In a sense, Bethesda effectively showed off all of their AI packages in this demo. An NPC finding their dog and talking to it might be a stretch in terms of the AI packages. NPCs can be given packages to find a bow and arrow as well as practice with these items. Saying the NPC will dynamically drink a Fortify Marksman potion because they missed their shots, on the other hand, well, there's a reason the designers showing this to Todd all had nervous expressions on their faces. But the AI can be given a package to consume a potion, which is how they handled it here. So the AI using an appropriate potion is, in a sense, a scripted event. The AI can have a package to locate meat and place it, but choosing to do that would be scripted based on this sequence. I mean, you could technically set this up in packages, but it would be fairly complex. AI do have a package for eating, although that directly translating to giving the dog a high energy level and running around is suspect. AI can have packages to read books in their environment. The AI casting Paralyze on our dog is technically a package, although in this case Todd is more so making the case that the AI can cast spells, not that the AI gets annoyed with the dog and dynamically decides to paralyze it. Todd is on the money with how the eat package works for NPCs, except I believe in regards to the claim that NPCs will grow food. AI will decide to sleep, and infamously, AI can be given packages to cast spells on other targets. Overall, I'd say about 90% of the demonstration is reasonably possible with the packages system. However, rather blatantly, what is being advertised isn't the possibilities of Radiant AI, but Radiant AI itself being applied to thousands of NPCs. Which means when players play the game and realize that most NPCs are nowhere near as complex in their behaviors, let alone possessing multiple behaviors of this complexity as this demonstration implies but does not outright state, this results in a lot of people looking at this demonstration as a lie. Again, we'll go into more detail with Radiant AI later. For now, we're simply assessing the E3 demo. Next, we see the map. Howard shows off fast travel and fast travels out of an interior cell. Less likely an advertisement as a feature and more so a structural convenience since you can't fast travel out of buildings.
Anymore.
sometimes.
In the game's main quest, the Emperor has been killed, and the gates to Oblivion have opened. You alone must find his lost son, or the whole world will fall.
Spoilers, dude. There's not much to say about the Kvatch segment, other than the actual battle for Kvatch quest plays out in a completely different manner. A few lies, but mostly just disingenuous statements which can be technically classified as correct with some truth-stretching and free legal work. If you compare it to the later promises, Howard would gradually get better at making less objective promises, or saying things that could easily be disproven. He might be known as the king of liars, but you can't say he hasn't leveled up at never being abjectly wrong. Whatever the case, Bethesda marched forward to its November 2005 release date, only to inevitably delay. They wanted to be a genuine launch title for the 360, but ended up needing 6 more months in the oven. It's hard to concretely say with these things, but by the point Bethesda shows us what they're selling us, it's usually too late for them to go back and make any drastic improvements to the system. Meaning, it's fair to say that, at best, your average questline in Oblivion had a 2.5-year time period of possible development. Oh yeah, remember when this point was speculation about how much time the writers/designers had? I mean, I was going to talk about the E3 demo regardless. To catch you back up, a lot of people see aliens as sort of generic fantasy elves, and not the slave master Jaeger-worshipping, jungle-living wild elves they were meant to be because of how little character really come across in both their dungeons and quests. The best we get is that they use a lot of traps, so that must mean they're fairly cruel in nature, but that could also just mean they don't like trespassers. Regardless, we've acquired our great Welkenstone. Martin's adorned in full armor and is talking to Joffrey about how this is the only way. He's thrilled we've managed to return to him with the Welkenstone, genuinely impressed at our tenacity and abilities. Martin is a selling point for a lot of people, and it's little moments like this where the game tries and arguably succeeds at making you feel like a friend to Martin that seals the deal.
It's the counterpart to the Great Welkenstone, just as the first two were the opposed powers of the Daedra and the Divines. Welkenstones contain the concentrated power of Mundus. Their counterparts are sigil stones, which are used to hold open Oblivion gates.
This is going to come back later when Mankar Cameron shares some of his ideas. So, Martin needs a great sigil stone, which we can only get from a great Oblivion gate. The same kind of gate that ended in Kvatch's destruction. Mind you, we only have confirmation of normal sigil stones existing, and it's possible the Great Gates are a special mechanism tied directly to Dagon. But Martin's confident, and I just can't say no to that face, or, well, really it's the voice.
And with Sean Bean, it was actually over the phone. So it was me and Kurt Kuhlman and I believe Todd Howard around the speakerphone. But you recognize the voice when you hear him.
You know what? Let's try a small exercise. You. Suppose you were sent to kill me. We're in this meeting together. You're sitting there in the chair, waiting for your moment. How would you kill me? What's the plan?
Fast-acting poison. Emetic. About 5 seconds from ingestion to reaction. Terrible accident.
Gruesome. But I survived worse than that.
He's willing to open a great gate at Bruma in order to recover the Amulet of Kings, and asks us to go down to the Countess and ask that she meet him at the Chapel of Talos. We kind of miss a memo by explaining the plan to her, when instead we should have just explained that the heir to the throne wishes to meet her at the chapel and let Martin do all the talking. This quest exposes several moments where the character is forced into certain dialogue lines, which usually isn't a problem because Elder Scrolls tends to avoid assigning emotion or personality to the player's lines whenever they don't have a choice. The hero of Kvatch is a specific character. Whatever character you've forged up to this point is effectively molded into the heroic archetype, which I think is missing the opportunities of the main quest to test the player's heroic attributes. It's fair to say in none of the other quests is the player really allowed to shine as a hero, so this could have been the crucible of that mentality. If the player had been shirking their responsibilities, ignoring Oblivion gates and using dirty tactics in the prior quests, then maybe the player would be offered dialogue lines to compensate for that. This obviously fits into a larger problem of Elder Scrolls generally lacking dialogue options, which will come up later when we discuss the Dark Brotherhood. The Countess is amiable to the idea of fighting a giant battle outside her city, which honestly makes the decision to do this in the Nordic city make sense. This is one of the few times the stoicism of the Nords reflects in its cultural embassy. That said, she does refer to this as a war, which is about as accurate as calling the Morrowind video quick. This is also the moment where Martin will share the most information about his past.
As a young man, I grew impatient with Mages Guild restrictions, as did many of my fellow apprentices. We threw ourselves into the riddles of Daedric magic. We hungered for forbidden secrets. Knowledge and power were our gods. You can guess the rest. We got in over our heads. People died. My friends died. I've put those days behind me, but the bitter wisdom that one has been a fool is not without value.
Before we start the battle, we have to discuss the Allies for Bruma quest. Not only is it long, it's actually longer than several other quests combined. We are tasked with going to the regional leaders of Cyrodiil to ask for aid in the defense of Bruma. However, this doesn't aid in the defense of Bruma up to this point, but rather just stockpiles soldiers for the coming great battle, as though we've been aware all along that this was coming. The difference is that the soldiers of this battle will have slightly better equipment and represent the various counties of Cyrodiil, turning it from a Bruma battle to a Cyrodiil battle. The difference between doing and avoiding this quest is generic NPCs. Granted, it's a cool idea to try and raise an army, and seeing all the different guys there for putting in the work is neat, but it's deflated by the fact that if I had not spent so much time doing a bunch of Oblivion gates, those guys would be there wearing yellow instead of a rainbow assortment. Each Allies for Bruma leg begins with asking the Count of a city for aid with Bruma. You can ask Okado, but he'll turn you down, and you can't ask any of the guilds for help, even the ones you're the leader of. There's no using my connections as the leader of both the Arena, Fighters, and Mages Guild in this situation. Each Count, once we use the adequate console commands to summon them to us because I don't care to wait, will tell us that they can't spare any guards for Bruma until a gate outside their city is closed. Each of these gates, bearing one notable exception, is the same randomized gate the player will have closed should they have been closing generic gates up to this point. After the tedious Oblivion gate, we return to the Count, use console commands to teleport them to us again because I got in trouble the last time I snuck into their quarters to ask them this very important question, and then they offer to send troops to Bruma. Kvatch and Shadenhall are different. Kvatch as captain of the guard will actually spare a soldier should you help him reclaim the castle.
You know, I saw your fight against the Grey Prince.
Let's talk about how busted this quest is from a logic perspective. The tension of this quest relies on the player closing the gate, saving the chapel, and then going and clearing out the castle. However, if the player gets here from the main quest, which they were shoved into via the urgent introduction, then they will be here to get Martin. A pragmatic player wouldn't stop to help the guards with the situation given that Martin needs to get to safety immediately. Assassins could come in the time we take helping to clear out Kvatch after all. Yet if the player decides to put off doing this quest, then the tension of trying to clear out the castle and save the Count of Kvatch is lost. It can be a week, even longer, and the guards will not have advanced their campaign to secure the city an inch without the player, and will try to pretend that saving the Count is even on the table when, at this point, the Daedra will most likely have gotten to him. The only way to approach this quest and make it make sense is how I did it, which was to ignore the urgency of delivering the amulet, go to Kvatch, take down the gate, clear out the castle, and then later come back to get Martin when we know he's important. That has its own problems, but helps make the honestly decent Battle for Castle Kvatch quest better by preserving its tension without the player having Martin in the back of their mind. And sure, we can just conclude that Martin is essential and that the game not only won't kill him on this quest, but that we can actually bring Martin to help us clear out the castle. But I try to roleplay these things, and from that perspective, there's no way to approach this quest that doesn't have issues. The other quest of note is the Shadenhall quest. Not only does it have a unique Oblivion gate, it has an entire quest tied to its Oblivion gate. The Count's son, Farwell Indaris, took his band of knights into the Oblivion gate. This is another example of why seeing Kvatch prior to its destruction would be a good thing. Prior to the Oblivion Crisis, the Knights of the Thorn, if the player pays attention to local lore, are basically just a local fraternity where they spend more time bragging about their exploits than actually accomplishing anything. However, when a gate pops up next to their headquarters, the Knights went in. This was disastrous for them and were to try and save the Count's son. Not only is he not essential, but there are consequences should he die.
He proceeded to fling himself into the lava doing a power attack. I warned you guys about those, they're not worth the fatigue.
And these consequences extend to him having died prior to this quest, even if it was out of the player's hands. And Farwell is appropriately foolhardy, easily getting himself killed chasing glory. This is honest, diegetic storytelling about a character who exists prior to this moment, who can survive after this moment if the player can protect them, and who is being characterized correctly in this situation. And the reward is pretty spiffy to boot. Simply put, the Wayward Knight is one of my favorite quests in Oblivion despite being an escort quest set in an Oblivion Gate, because it shows the potential for what could have been. Even though its Oblivion Gate visually glitched out, I couldn't help but feel impressed with its design. Unlike every other leg of the Allies for Bruma quest, this is so unique I have to wonder why the others were so bland and generic. I can't help but compare this to the Hortator and Nerevarine quest series, where the player of Morrowind would go around acquiring titles with the great houses and Ashlander tribes. Each quest there, however, was unique and appropriately reflected on the culture of its faction, meaning that if the player hadn't interacted with those factions before, they would still have an understanding of who it was they were saving. Oblivion fails in that respect, but succeeds in actually making these quests meaningful. Kind of. Being the Hortator and Nerevarine was meaningless given how the Battle of Red Mountain series played out, and having those factions support is only necessary to fulfill the prophecy, and even then you can bypass all the quests by having enough reputation, which was a hefty requirement. That said, giving the player a contingent of slightly stronger guards is not really a good reward for the sheer time and energy investment that is the Allies for Bruma quest, and it's often described as a weak point of the main quest. Having our allies recruited, they gradually roll up to Bruma and form into a camp. Even if it's goofy hearing Wes Johnson talk to himself a dozen times, seeing all these guards does elicit a feeling that what we're about to do is significant. As we march out of the city for battle, the citizens even cheer us on, which is a great detail. Martin even gives a speech.
We must hold fast until the hero of Kvatch can destroy their great gate. We must kill whatever comes out of that gate.
Whoa, hey Martin. Big Dick Captain Bird came to battle in his nightwear. I'm sure he can handle that great gate no problem given he's been closing gates just like us for some time off screen. When people complain about the Battle of Bruma doesn't feel epic because there's not hundreds of people on screen, sure, I get that. But by Oblivion standards, I'm sorry, I'm the anti-Oblivion guy and I'm fucking hyped for this battle. And yeah, sure, I played with the difficulty turned down because the game's busted scaling meant I would have been slashing opponents dozens of times in the middle of the chaos. I didn't want this section to be challenging, I wanted it to be epic, and to me, it is. It has all the prototypical elements of a Lord of the Rings movie speech, followed by the great animation of the gates opening that the player won't have seen yet, and finally that great gate opening. The great gate itself is a timed dungeon, giving the player 15 minutes to complete the gate or Bruma falls when the Daedric siege engine makes it through the portal. Another failure state is Martin's death, though the battle outside the portal is effectively paused once we enter. Yes, Martin's not essential for this battle, and should he die, the game ends. I'm not sure how I feel about the game having a hard ending, but it's nice to see all the major players lose their essential flags. It takes the wind out of the sails of those who argue for essential flags, since Bethesda trusted the player enough to try and keep Martin alive during this battle. Granted, it would be neat if Martin dies and the game continues, like the main quest instantly fails and suddenly gates start popping up absolutely everywhere in a full-blown invasion. It might be a lot to ask for a post-apocalyptic Cyrodiil as an alternative ending in a game with such a tight development, but you must admit it would be neato to actually see a fully realized consequence like that. It must have been anticlimactic at Kvatch to see the Great Gate open, only for nothing that big to come out of it for 15 whole minutes. So, how is Oblivion's final gate? We step in and immediately see the vision Big U showed us at the start of the game, a great siege engines marching toward us and spraying fireballs to boot. The thing is, it only took me 6 minutes to get to the Sigil Stone. There are random Oblivion gates more dangerous than the Great Gate, probably because Bethesda needed the average player to be able to complete the Great Gate if they somehow got their character stuck at this quest and couldn't reload to a previous save for whatever reason. I don't know, just make a save for the player at some point. With the Great Sigil Stone in hand, we've won the battle, and even though there are several other gates as well, I'll assume those were handled by the guys outside and not tied to the Great Gate. Martin tells us he's going to prepare the ritual, and we set off to prepare for the unknown.
I have everything in place for the ritual. I'll open the portal whenever you're ready.
Martin explains that the portal will be one way and speculates that Mankar Cameron is an anchor for the realm and will need to be killed for us to return. The ritual is performed, we head in, and are greeted by Paradise. Paradise represents the possibilities of Oblivion, and its visual design is unlike anything else seen in Oblivion. Purple vegetation, a perpetual state of sunset, intact Iliad structures, deer roaming around alongside the Daedra, and constant torture of Mankar's subjects. Mankar also does some narration, becoming aware of us the moment we arrived. We're going to break down Cameron's lines all at once later, just bear in mind we're being narrated to as we progress. Eventually we come across mana bloom plants, which are the only respawning source of ambrosia and lycor in the game, which are both single effect plants that restore health and magicka respectively. The path eventually leads to the Dremora Cathatet. He greets us peacefully, remarking that we destroyed the Sigil Tower at Ganona, or the gate that opened at Kvatch. He's got some interesting lines.
Your swift retribution earned you much respect among my people. We had not expected that a mortal would act with such resolution and honor. It is no dishonor for us to speak. You speak directly, like one of my people almost. I'm glad I did not kill you immediately.
Cathatet offers us a choice. To progress into the Forbidden Grotto, we need the bands of the Chosen. We can fight him for them or earn them through service, as both are honorable. I choose service and we get sent on a short quest to free a trapped Zivile, Anaxes, from some ascended immortals who tracked him in a cave. Free Anaxes, return, and then I reject taking the bands from him.
You are unlike any other mortal I have encountered. You serve me, and then you spurn the reward for your service. Come, as an equal, I shall grace your name and corpse with honor.
Also, you can play Persuasion Pie with Cathatet since Dremora are actually NPCs and not creatures like in Morrowind. And they forgot to give him the flag to prevent persuasion. This also means he has a black soul despite being a Daedra. We head into the grotto, the shackles now stuck on preventing our escape. After some Daedra killing, we meet Eldamil, a delusioned Mankar worshipper who will help us with our situation by getting us past the Dremora Overseer. He removes our shackles and comes with us to fight with Mankar. Finally, we've reached the moment where we reveal what this game is truly about. Obviously, we can't talk about Mankar Cameron without mentioning the fact that he's the last member of Oblivion's star-studded cast. Blowing a giant stack of cash so you can wrangle up Patrick Stewart, who is in the prime of his fame from Star Trek The Next Generation, and the TNG movies, I guess, so that he can be a voice in the trailer and have 10 minutes of screen time is one thing. Hiring Sean Bean, who had a prominent role in The Lord of the Rings, a movie so significant to fantasy, and then having Sean Bean voice the protagonist of your main quest for the entire game is another. Hell, that makes Terrence Stamp's cameo as Mankar Cameron almost insignificant. Still, it's the voice recording session that the Making of Oblivion documentary showed off, with Todd Howard flying out to London personally to get the lines.
Neil Todd.
You gotta put that in.
Smile.
Oh yeah, that's a Neumann U87 microphone, one of the best and most expensive microphones money can buy. Granted, they would have been renting time in a recording studio, just thought I would point it out. As someone who spent a lot of money on a microphone, thanks patrons. Given that Cameron is the game's principal antagonist, one would hope Bethesda would have learned from Morrowind's antagonist, Dagoth-Ur. Dagoth-Ur had a compelling conversation, but most of the time his presence in the main quest proper came in the form of his servants and a few text-based dreams, and Dagoth-Ur proper lacked any substantial screen time until the conclusion of Morrowind's main quest. Cameron corrects this, using that celebrity voice talent to appear a single time in the main quest before our arrival in Paradise, where he doesn't acknowledge the player. The difference, though, is that we get a generally good idea of who Dagoth-Ur is before we ever meet him. Until the time came that I generally had to write about Mankar Cameron, I couldn't have really told you much about him. For instance, we know that Dagoth-Ur was the one who reported the Dwemer's plans to create Numidium, effectively starting the series of events that led to their disappearance. Dagoth-Ur was entrusted with the Heart of Lorkhan, and the various claims of what happened after that are a big part of Morrowind's story. Mankar, on the other hand, well, for a long time I just assumed that Mankar Cameron was a former Ayleid king who, after the rise of men, spent a couple thousand years coming up with a plot to eventually overthrow the Septim Empire and bring Tamriel under Elvish domination again. All of that is information I assumed based on the Ayleid architecture of Paradise and because the quest involves Sancre Tor, which was a significant place in Cyrodiilic lore. As we complete Martin's tasks, he'll gradually accumulate literature on his desk that is relevant to the plot. One of these books is titled The Refugees, which is a light armor skill book that can only be found here and at the first edition bookstore from earlier in the main quest when we were getting the commentaries. The book details the birth of Mankar Cameron and constitutes the bulk of his lore page. Mankar was born to a Bosmeri refugee, whom as the story progresses is revealed to have been the mistress to Haemon Cameron, who had been a primary instigator in a massive civil war that embroiled Valenwood, Colovia, Hammerfell, and High Rock. So remember when Taormina said the commentaries of the Mysterium Xarxes were contemporary with Tiber Septim? Not the Xarxes itself, she specifies the commentaries.
The commentaries are contemporary with Tiber Septim, over 400 years ago, so he is unlikely to still be alive, although you never know.
Okay, well, the Pocket Guide to the Empire, 3rd edition, which physically came with Oblivion's Collector's Edition, has a section on Valenwood which dates the war with the Cameron usurper to the 3rd era, year 249. That means that not only was Mankar born far after the establishment of the Septim dynasty, but that his birth is closer to the current year than it is to the death of Tiber Septim. You can almost say this is intentional, seeing as the Arcane University's expert, which in turn likely means Tamriel's expert, in Daedric Cults didn't make the connection that the Mankar Cameron who wrote these commentaries was the same Mankar Cameron of this book. But we can forgive that. Again, Oblivion's world isn't to scale and doesn't have the internet, moth priests, so such a connection could easily go unnoticed. However, it's important to mention that in Elder Scrolls, race is passed down via the mother, which is detailed in Notes on Racial Phylogeny. And given that Mankar's mother was a Bosmer and Mankar clearly isn't, something's wrong. If anything, given that Mankar doesn't mention his legacy and that the story doesn't draw attention to this book despite its placement in main quest areas, I believe the refugees to be a possible red herring. Although again, there are several similarities between Mankar and the Heart King's stories that make that difficult to believe. This is where I start to say words like portonymic and neonymic and a bunch of high lore concepts to dance around the fact that someone made a fucky-wucky and said the commentaries are older than they should be and that Mankar's the wrong race. Why does Mankar live in an Ayleid building? Because he used Nimic surgery to change himself into an Ayleid and make himself Dragonborn so he could wield the Amulet of Kings. How did he do this? Because Mehrunes Dagon taught him how to use Mehrunes Razor to open the construction set and do a race edit. All of this is in the lore. You can read about it in the Trial of... Oh no, wait, that was a forum post and not in the games. I mean, it is canon if you manage to beat Battlespire since they had to invent some bullshit to make it possible to defeat Mehrunes Dagon at the end. Talk about nonsense, justifying a mistake by referencing a lore argument that happens in a game a grand total of like 17 people ever beat. Hey, if it's as easy as saying Mehrunes Dagon base and reference ID, then how come we're bothering to go to Paradise and all and not just waiting for him to turn up so we can say the magic words and make him disappear? I guess that would be pretty anticlimactic after all, so maybe it's better if we leave the Nimic surgery stuff out. Look at it like this. There is zero, and I mean absolutely zero, story benefits to having Mankar Cameron be the son of Haemon Cameron beyond being able to draw a lore connection to Daggerfall, I guess. Instead, let's redraft this. First fix, just make him a Bosmer. You might say, that looks silly. But given the number of people who swear by Fargoth-Ur, I would argue that having the main villain be a Bosmer would actually be the best thing that happened to the Wood Elves since it would help uplift that race out of perpetual meme status. Second proposal. This is now Mankar Cameron, last king of the Ayleids. His bloodline was the first of the Dragonborn to wear the Amulet of Kings before Alesia stole it and later history was revised to claim that she was the originator. Mankar was born in the final days of the Ayleids' presence on Cyrodiil, near the end of the Second Era when Tiber Septim finally extinguished their culture completely. As a young man, he ventured through Tamriel, experiencing the various cultures of the elves, and realized that Merrick culture could potentially be unified through a mutual hatred of Talos. The upper echelon of the Mythic Dawn would be committed to the reversal of Lorkhan's scheme to create mortality, effectively restoring the world to its primordial and timeless state. By the time the men of the Mythic Dawn realized what was happening, they would arrive in Paradise where they would be perpetually tormented in order to maintain a purity of rank. In essence, the Mythic Dawn would become the genesis of the Thalmor, except without Mankar, it becomes about an Altmeri dominion over Tamriel instead of the restoration of Ayleid culture. You could even link it to several conspiracies to create elvish superpowers, such as Dunmer Mythic Dawn members awakening Dagoth-Ur or playing a part in the fall of Dagoth-Ur and by extension the Tribunal, returning the Dunmer to Daedra worship. How about the Mythic Dawn propping up the Necromancer cult and creating an elvish replacement for Archae and Mannimarco while at the same time undermining the Empire's Mages Guild? You don't have to use all of those ideas, but making Mankar an actual Ayleid king would resolve several of the issues. Of course, the biggest issue with this is giving Terrence Stamp more lines, and that means paying him more money. According to Michael Kirkbride, Mankar's speech came from an email where he was just writing dialogue to help with his work on the commentaries, and Todd Howard ended up using it as dialogue on short notice, which is why Mankar gets several details wrong. His line,
"Many are their names and the names of their masters. The cold harbor of Meridia, Periite's quagmire,
The 10 moon shadows of Mephala and...
He attributes the wrong planes of Oblivion to the wrong Daedric princes, because Mankar's wrong in some respects. People have used this to easily and smugly discount his entire thesis. Let's at least listen to what he has to say.
So, the cat's paw of the Septims arrives at last. You didn't think you could take me unawares, here of all places, in the paradise that I created. Look now upon my paradise. Gaia Alata in the old tongue, a vision of the past and the future. Behold the savage garden, where my disciples are tempered for a higher destiny, to rule over Tamriel Reborn. How little you understand. You cannot stop Lord Dagon. The principalities have sparkled as gems in the black reaches of Oblivion since the first morning. Many are their names and the names of their masters. The cold harbour of Meridia, Periite's quagmire, the 10 moon shadows of Mephala and Dawn's beauty, the princedom of Lorkhan, misnamed Tamriel by deluded mortals. Yes, you understand now. Tamriel is just one more Daedric realm of Oblivion, long since lost to its prince when he was betrayed by those that served him. Lord Dagon cannot invade Tamriel, his birthright. He comes to liberate the occupied lands. Ask yourself, how is it that mighty gods die, yet the Daedra stand incorruptible? How is it that the Daedra forthrightly proclaim themselves to man, while the gods cower behind statues and the faithless words of traitor priests? It is simple. They are not gods at all. The truth has been in front of you since you first were born. The Daedra are the true gods of this universe. Julianos, Dibella, and Stondar are all Lorkhan's betrayers, posing as divinities in the principality that has lost its guiding light. What are scholarship, love, and mercy when compared to fate, night, and destruction? The gods you worship are trifling shadows of first causes. They have tricked you for ages. Why do you think your world has always been contested ground, the arena of powers and immortals? It is Tamriel, the realm of change, brother to madness, sister to deceit. Your false gods could not entirely rewrite history. Thus you remember tales of Lorkhan vilified, a dead trickster whose heart came to Tamriel. But if a god can die, how does his heart survive? He is Daedroth, Tamriel I Daedroth. This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other. You all remember this. It is in every legend. Daedra cannot die, so your so-called gods cannot erase him from your minds completely. Well done, champion. Your progress is swift and sure. Perhaps you will reach me after all. You think I mock you? Not at all. In your coming, I hear the footsteps of fate. You are the last defender of decadent Tamriel. I am the midwife of the mythic dawn, Tamriel Reborn. I welcome you, if you truly are the agent of fate. I tire of the self-styled heroes who set themselves in my path only to prove unworthy in the event. I have waited a long time for you, champion of old Tamriel. You were the last gasp of a dying age. You breathed the stale air of false hope. How little you understand. You cannot stop Lord Dagon. The walls between our worlds are crumbling. The mythic dawn grows nearer with every rift in the firmament. Very soon, the lines now blurred will be erased. Tamriel and Oblivion rejoined, the mythic age reborn. Lord Dagon shall walk Tamriel again. The world shall be remade. The new age shall rise from the ashes of the old. My vision shall be realized. Weakness will be purged from the world, and mortal and immortal alike purified in the refiner's fire. My long duel with the Septims is over, and I have the mastery. The Emperor is dead. The Amulet of Kings is mine. And the last defender of the last ragged Septim stands before me in the heart of my power. Let us see who at last has proved the stronger.
Got all that? All of that had to have gone through an editor because, when compared to the commentaries, it's at least comprehensible. As to his theories, in my eyes it's not entirely improbable, but also likely not accurate. Lorkhan isn't really a Daedra. It's more that he defies classification because he died before the difference in Aedra and Daedra even existed. Assuming he didn't die, then he would be a Daedra, but that would also mean that Lorkhan would be around somewhere and that Mehrunes' plan to conquer Tamriel is an act of liberation, even though, arguably, Lorkhan doesn't need liberation as this may well be his intended outcome. In any event, it's impossible to ignore Mehrunes Dagon as a party in this story. Now, we could put off a discussion of Mehrunes Dagon until he shows up in the final quest, but let's not. Mehrunes Dagon. I mean, look at the guy. What other impressions could you possibly have about him? His visual design goes back to Battlespire, and Morrowind would add many of the more demonic details to his character, but it was Oblivion that decided to make him bright red, 50 feet tall, and filled his plane with obvious hell symbolism. A layperson who doesn't know Elder Scrolls takes one look at this character and assumes everything there is to know about him. But what if I told you that I was about to blow your mind? That I could recontextualize everything about this story, and that I've come to the conclusion that people have been sleeping on Oblivion's main quest being one of the best quest lines in Howard's Elder Scrolls. Don't believe me? Mehrunes Dagon set Mankar Cameron up for failure. In fact, his goal was never to successfully invade Tamriel or to install a new empire, and even better, Mehrunes Dagon got his desired outcome. Again, a normal person looks at Mehrunes Dagon and sees Satan. No, not even that Satan, this Satan.
Hey, Satan.
The comical Satan that somehow has the power to stand against God and who is endeavoring in every aspect of life to undermine the good morals of honest Americans. This gets into actual religious lore, so I'll try to keep it brief. In the Bible, God tells a guy to not go back to a city. This is Old Testament where God was a lot more hands-on. God ends up sending an angel to Earth to stop this guy who doesn't immediately see the angel and needs his ass to tell him to shape up in the presence of divinity. Satan essentially starts his presence in the Bible as an agent of God, and later in the story powered up from blocking asses to delivering a plague to punish David. Obviously, the writers have realized that having God himself do these terrible things is bad for the moral of the story, and so are using Satan as a character to divorce God from the things God is doing. This trend continues into the story of Job. Now, Satan isn't referred directly by name, rather the word Satan is used to describe the role the angel is playing in these stories. In the story of Job, however, he refers to this character effectively using Satan as a title, and Satan tells him that he's been roaming the realms of men. This is the first story where Satan is allowed to be evil, where he destroys Job's life under the pretense that, even as a devotee of God, Job will abandon his faith. If you've ever wondered why it's called a job, read this story. Funny thing is, right? Yahweh's basically letting Satan run a train on this poor guy's life just to prove how much of a loser incel Satan is, which is a pretty good indicator of where the mentality of the writer's room was at this point in the series. It didn't help that Zoroastrianism started influencing the writers and suddenly the angels were having human temptations. Probably without realizing it, they had effectively implied that by sheer contact with humans, these angels were being turned to sin. This set a bad precedent that the splinter religions and their fanfictions would take into full effect. Satan's characterization would take a ramp up in the New Testament after the property changed hands. His Retconia story was that Satan was a fallen angel and now a tempter to the ways of evil. This poor guy who started as an angel just trying to do his job and stop a guy from disobeying God is now trying to trick Jesus Christ himself into sin so that he can prove once and for all that he is not in fact an incel loser. This whole character arc screams unplanned writing and would have been better handled if there was a clear moment for Satan's character where he actually fell from grace and that explained why he was so resolute on trying to prove God wrong, or establishing any kind of stakes to power that would make it so that God couldn't just immediately erase his character from existence at the first sign of backsass. Satan's poor character writing, with many of the same flaws as Judas' character writing, led to over a millennia of reinterpretation and fanfiction. Are the kids being bad? Tell them that Satan will snatch them in the woods. Are the adults not donating 10% of their income like good Christians? Tell them that Satan will fuck their ass in hell. It's not necessarily the fault of the believers that they use Satan like this, considering the precedent was set all the way back in the story of Job. I mean, if the main point of your story is that anyone is capable of receiving the Lord's forgiveness, then surely Satan's pretty high up on the list of characters deserving a redemption arc. In any event, popular culture first obsessed with Satan as a figure who represented evil, and then as an example of where you'll end up if you are evil, but at some point the message got corrupted and became this confusing modern narrative that Satan is the Lord of Hell. Which leads us to Bethesda who, in an effort to make a story about good versus evil, abandoned all pretense entirely and converted one of their Daedric princes into the pop culture icon of Satan, complete with religious revisionism. So let's strip that back. Mehrunes Dagon's only real presence in the game is as the antagonist of the main quest. Some people like to point out the Mehrunes Razor plugin, although since you can't sacrifice the razor and there isn't much lore about Dagon in the DLC, it's not really relevant. The first piece we have is the Mysterium Xarxes, a book directly written by Mehrunes Dagon himself. Martin indicates the book is dangerous to read without magical protection, but really it's unclear if he means the book has the power to corrupt its reader or if the book contains information that inevitably corrupts its reader. That might seem like minutia, but that second detail is important if you consider that Mehrunes Dagon is the Daedric Prince of Destruction and Revolution. The book may well contain some inevitable truths that would push even the most devout person down the wrong path. It's possible that there isn't anything actually written in the book until it is opened, at which point it's filled with whatever truth is necessary to sway the reader. A mimetic truth that changes its meaning to fit the reader. The thing is, Martin seems to have far too easy a time deciphering the Xarxes to recreate the ritual to open a portal to paradise. My argument is this. Mehrunes Dagon wanted Martin to complete the ritual, for the player to kill Mankar, and for Martin to then die at the Temple of the One. Why? Mankar did not want to change the status quo of Tamriel. Not really. He was more so advocating that the Septim Empire be replaced with a Cameron Empire. A beneficial position to be in when the world reverts to the Mythic Age, to be sure. Mehrunes doesn't really want that, and as Jesus pointed out to Satan, why would you give someone the power that you know is going to usurp you? At the same time, Mehrunes Dagon has no interest in installing another Septim to the throne, especially given his involvement with the other Septim Emperors. Instead, neither party got the throne. The Septim dynasty fell and Tamriel returned to a state where conflict plagued the land. However, it's important to note that being the Prince of Revolution is not being the Prince of Chaos. If that were the case, then Mehrunes would absolutely have gone for the plan to restore the Mythic Age, even if it meant getting stuck with a prick like Mankar. The thing about Revolution is that it requires a sense of linear time. In some respects, Mehrunes Dagon couldn't really exist as he truly is without Lorkhan's plan. So Mehrunes used Mankar's ambition as a ploy to host his own revolution against the Septim dynasty, and then when Mankar Cameron held the upper hand, used the player's tenacity as a ploy to host a revolution against the Mythic Dawn. After we return from Paradise, we take the amulet to the Imperial City and try to light the Dragonfires, only to find that Mehrunes Dagon and the forces of Oblivion have invaded en masse. However, if you look at the actual game files, Mankar Cameron's death actually marks a point where the gates slowed down the rate at which they open. This isn't communicated to the player directly, but the percentage chance of a gate opening at a spot is determined by a variable, the chance raising and lowering based on the events of the quests. But why? If the Dragonfires being unlit is impetus enough for the Daedra to invade, then surely Mehrunes Dagon would have just turned up and destroyed the city by now. At the very least, you would think that he would destroy the Temple of the One to straight up game over the Empire. The answer is that this is all going according to Mehrunes Dagon's extremely convoluted plan. Being the Prince of Destruction is all well and good until you've won and realize that there isn't anyone around to build things for you to destroy. Just like how Mehrunes isn't going to work towards putting someone in power that would try to prevent him from throwing a revolution, Mehrunes is also motivated to pull back at the last moment from winning so that the world can recover and ripen up fresh for another destruction in the future. But why then would Mehrunes effectively be responsible for permanently closing the door to future invasions? Well, we'll talk about that more when we discuss Martin's character. For now, I want to show you Mehrunes Dagon's most loyal servant, Eldamil. Eldamil does have a line about making prayers to Akatosh, but that's a red herring. The Divines generally don't work in such direct ways, and given the timeline Eldamil gives us, it's fair to say that we were probably on our way here long before Eldamil started praying. See, we have to answer the question of why all these loyal subjects of the Mythic Dawn are being tortured. At base value, we take it as Mehrunes and Mankar being evil bastards, or that they're really trying to harden and test their devotees. I think in reality what it represents is a punishment for those who don't understand the truth of Mehrunes Dagon. These were the blind worshippers of Mehrunes Dagon who thought he would be a path to domination over others and not liberation. In the same vein, the only people in Paradise who are having a good time right now are the worshippers we see who trapped Anaxes. By revolting against their masters, they earned the chance to stay in the nice part of Paradise, but it's natural order for Cathatet to eventually crush that revolution. Through the Xarxes, Mehrunes showed Mankar exactly what Cameron needed to see to get the ball rolling. If you compare the Mythic Dawn commentaries to an actual translation of the Mythic Dawn, you find that Mankar actually caught quite a bit of information out of the book. This is because he was proactive, so he needed a lot more than what Martin needed, as Martin was reactive. Note that the characterization of Mehrunes Dagon isn't exactly that outlandish. Mehrunes opposed the Tribunal on several occasions, likely because the Tribunal was a dogmatic religion hell-bent on maintaining themselves and their status quo. Yet despite having opportunities in the past to invade Morrowind, his antics never went too far. Then again, it was the Tribunal, and that's Morrowind lore, so it doesn't bear debating here. Mehrunes could have invaded Tamriel at any time the Dragonfires weren't lit. Remember when I mentioned that Tiber Septim had to get the Amulet of Kings off the body of Reman III? Yeah, Reman's death marked the end of the First Era, and Tiber Septim's conquest marked the beginning of the Third Era. Put 2 and 2 together, and that's almost 900 years of Mehrunes Dagon having the door open and doing nothing with it. Of course, there's the ESO lore that Molag Bal copied the plot of Oblivion and invaded Tamriel in the Second Era, but ESO isn't canon to Oblivion and you just have to accept that.
While the prophecy of the Nerevarine can be interpreted as the end of the tribunal, I have always seen it as a prediction of hope and peace.
With this recontextualization in mind, the main quest goes from mediocre to mind-blowing. Why did the Daedra invade Kvatch but fail to take the chapel, the one thing they came there to do? To motivate Martin into rebelling against the tyranny of Cameron. Why didn't the enemy take steps to stop us from completing the ritual, to make it possible? Why did the siege engine take 15 minutes to emerge from the portal, so we could get the sigil stone? Why did Mehrunes Dagon delay his invasion of the Imperial City until after Martin's arrival? To ensure that Martin would be forced to sacrifice himself, mantle Akatosh, and end the Septim dynasty. The only problem with this is, it's super subtle. Mehrunes Dagon didn't have a single voice line in the entire game, so we're never given the impression that he's actually playing both sides of the conflict. Morrowind didn't sit the player down and force them to read every interpretation of the murder of Nerevar for people to love that questline, so the fact that most people don't even consider this plot point when discussing Oblivion is a good sign that we may have gone too far in a few places in terms of subtlety. I can't help but feel that most of the pieces are here for this to have been an amazing story. I mean, Kurt Coleman started the series with Redguard and still contributes at Bethesda. Ken Rolston wrote Morrowind's main quest, and they had Michael Kirkbride on hand willing to handle the higher lore concepts. And given that they were willing to pay for not one but 3 celebrity voice cameos for this one quest line, you would think that it would have been a priority at Bethesda to make sure that this was the best quest line in the game. Instead, most people just like to brag that they've never done Oblivion's main quest. And people who do play Oblivion's main quest tend to write it off as a boring and generic story, in large part because you can get all the pieces together for a good story, but if you never actually place them all on the board for the player to see, then the only people who are really going to get it are detailed focused nerds like myself. Finally, we arrive at Martin's character. A common interpretation of Martin's character is that he is the chosen one of the story, a twist on the Nerevarine story by taking that role away from the player. Less common, in fact a rarity, is any interpretation which states who chose Martin. The Nerevarine was chosen by Azura for the purpose of ending Dagothor and the False Tribunal, and the Dragonborn was chosen by Akatosh for the purpose of reminding Alduin of his role in the mythos as a destroyer, not as a dominator. The question is, who chose Martin, and for what purpose? One might think Akatosh. After all, Martin is a priest of Akatosh, Eldamil prays to Akatosh for Mankar's defeat, and Akatosh shows up after the amulet is sacrificed to defeat Mehrunes Dagon. So case closed, right? Here's the thing. If you read about the origin of the Amulet of Kings, discounting the stuff from ESO that ties it to Lorkhan, the amulet is said to originate from Akatosh's heart when he made a compact with Alesia that would prevent the invasion of Daedra and Tamriel as long as the Dragonborn sat on the throne and maintained the Dragonfires. First, we have to ask the question of how Akatosh accomplishes this, which is speculation of course, but what mechanism of Akatosh enables him to prevent the hostile invasion of Daedra? Akatosh, and by extension the dragons and Jills as well, represent time, and each of those aspects generally has a role to play in its maintenance. The Jills sweep up the mess of dragon breaks when an event occurs involving divinity that temporarily reverts an area to non-linear time. A dragon break is how both Orsinium was founded and Mannimarco ascended to godhood at the end of Daggerfall, despite the impossibility of that being the case. The dragons seem to play a role as mobile anchors of time, which is why their departure from Atmora caused it to freeze over, both literally and figuratively. In any case, Akatosh's main domain is time, so it's possible that Akatosh isn't blocking Tamrielic invasions as much as he's delaying them to the end of linear time, which begs the next question, why is Akatosh playing this role, and what is his motivation to do so? This gets into a really complicated discussion of Tamrielic lore and religious interpretations about the relationship between Akatosh and Lorkhan. Look, if you want my opinion on this, make an Elder Scrolls game set in that era. You don't have to concretely answer what happened, just boil it down to a couple clean theories. In any event, Akatosh was apparently the one responsible for the death of Lorkhan, if such a thing is even believed to have happened, and this event generally marks the schism in most belief structures in Tamriel. It makes sense for the Elvish believers of Akatosh who knew him as Ariel to claim that Ariel was responsible for the death of Lorkhan, considering they are all very, very mad about that mortality thing that Lorkhan did. However, given that Lorkhan was considered a hero to men, it's hard to believe that Akatosh would become the effective head of the Imperial Pantheon under this narrative. It's possible that we have a situation similar to the interpretation some people have of Judas Iscariot. It's classically believed by most Christians that Judas was a traitor to Jesus. However, a minority of people believe that Jesus actually intended for Judas to play this role in the story, and Judas is in fact the most loyal of Jesus' apostle for his sacrifice. In the same vein, it's possible that Akatosh is worshipped by men because he played the critical role in the murder of Lorcan, which Lorcan intended to have happen from the beginning. The Aedra are generally considered to have gotten a raw deal out of convention, having been promised to be lords of Mundus while the Daedra got to be lords of their own planes without a fraction of the sacrifice. If Mankar were correct that Lorcan is a Daedra and that Tamriel is his plane of Oblivion, then it doesn't stand to reason that Akatosh would bother to protect it. However, a case could be made that Akatosh is protecting Mundus from Oblivion as atonement for his transgression against Lorcan, and that the end of time represents the point at which Akatosh is forgiven. Now that we have the how and why of Akatosh covered, we have to answer the final question. If Mehrunes Dagon intended for this outcome, why would he do so in a way that would end the Daedra's ability to invade Tamriel? This is where we introduce the concept of mantling, which is super important in the story of the Shivering Isles and why I think they handled it the way they did. In Elder Scrolls, it is generally considered to be possible for a mortal being to become a god. This is seen in three big instances: the Dwemer, Tiber Septim, and the Tribunal. However, this isn't as straightforward as meeting a few conditions and having a switch flipped for you. Rather, the process of becoming a divine is usually destructive to the person who undergoes that process. The Dwemer, when they mantled as a race, disappeared from existence and arguably became the godlike Golem Numidium. Tiber Septim went on to mantle Shor/Lorcan, and the Tribunal went on to mantle Azura, Mephala, and Boethia, although arguably they failed as they attempted to retain their personalities in this process. In this game, I would argue that Martin, with the combined souls of all the Dragonborn who had lit the Dragonfires before him, mantled Akatosh in this scene. The biggest piece of evidence for this is actually Skyrim, where the player is the first Dragonborn to have been created in millennia, and whose main plot required this event to have occurred. With Akatosh replaced and suddenly more active in the world stage, Martin can confidently make the promise that the Oblivion gates are closed forever. At least, the hostile gates are closed forever. Yet Mehrunes Dagon and the other less friendly princes are still active in the world after Oblivion. Let's look at it like this. Mehrunes Dagon did not wish to conquer or destroy Tamriel, as is feared by the mortals. Rather, Mehrunes Dagon wanted to create the circumstances that the traitor Akatosh would be mantled, so that Akatosh would get off his couch and actually start doing his job again, and stop using the Dragonborn for that purpose. Molag Bal and Jiggalag are pretty much the only guys around that would actually bother to invade other places for the purposes of controlling them. So who chose Martin? I don't think it was Akatosh. I think it was Mehrunes Dagon. I think that Boris's line, if he survives to the end, sums up the story best.
The scholars and priests can debate what happened to Martin in the end.
A lot of the iniquities with Oblivion's main quest can be boiled down to this. Ken Rolston decided to take a hands-off approach when it came to writing Oblivion. Michael Kirkbride was not as involved in the project as a writer. Kurt Coleman did a good job of creating quests to the specification of his bosses, and it was ultimately Todd Howard that looked at this quest line and saw none of the problems. To quote Ken Rolston, Morrowind is to Oblivion what Moby Dick is to the Da Vinci Code. No comment. So now that we've ended the main quest, Oblivion is over, right? It seems hard to justify a character continuing from here given the sheer cult of personality that would be created around a figure like the Champion of Cyrodiil. To me, this is the problem with the urgency of Oblivion's introduction. If you roleplay the character, you can't really ignore the main quest, but by the end, how are you supposed to justify going back to the mundanity of the arena or Fighters Guild? Still, it's nice to see the remnants of the main quest. The closed Oblivion gates that dot the landscape, the battle-damaged temple district, the new statue of Akatosh, the leftovers from the Battle of Bruma, and a statue constructed in her honor. It has a unique method of determining what items to put on the statue. For example, it prioritized putting the Wabbajack in my hands over the ebony blade that I actively used. Still, I have one more thing to mention, and that was the time I crashed the game multiple times even with the unofficial patch and a crash prevention mod. See, there are tons of fun little staves with interesting effects that may or may not cause issues with how certain quests are scripted. So when I fought Mankar, I decided to go all out, maxing the difficulty to make up for minimizing it during the Battle of Bruma, and use most of the tools I collected at this point. Summoned a Daedra, cloned someone, resurrected someone else, used the Wabbajack to shapeshift someone, made use of all these fancy powers I've been collecting. I'm being general because I don't remember the specific details. Anyways, I'm having the slightest bit of fun with this fight, and of course it breaks. The first time seems to be because the game is checking to see when the daughters die to progress the quest, and since one of them is technically alive due to being reanimated, it broke. The second time the game crashed was when a clone of Mankar Cameron summoned a Dremora that shot lightning that hit the original Mankar, instantly crashing the game. The third time, I managed to be the one to land the killing blow and it let me pass. I'll tell you more about all those fun tools in Part 9 when we discuss the Daedra. For now, let's do the opposite.